If you can hear my voice tonight, it means you're still awake. Still listening. Still wandering the quiet places inside your mind where the world gets thinner, softer, easier to slip through. Welcome, night traveler. To Night Terrors, 5 Tales for the Sleepless. Sometimes, when the hour grows late enough, when the city outside sinks beneath its own shadows, and the walls of your room settle with that familiar, patient sigh, you begin to notice things you missed during the day. A sound that shouldn't be there. A shape lingering in the corner of your eye. A feeling that someone, or something, is sharing the darkness with you. Tonight, I have 5 stories. 5 quiet tragedies. 5 soft warnings. 5 places where the veil slips just enough for us to see what waits on the other side. First, we'll board a bus that shouldn't exist. A silent route that appears only for those who are too tired to notice the world is bending around them. Then, we'll open a cedar chest in a forgotten farmhouse and discover what happens when an object loves you far more deeply, and far more jealously, than any living soul ever could. After that, we'll descend into the archives below a New England library, where knowledge has a price that not even death can fully settle. We'll take a detour along a lonely interstate where fate waits in the dark like a hitchhiker with your name on its lips. And finally, we'll close the door behind us in a quiet apartment high above a frozen city, and see what happens when a dollhouse decides it wants more than company, when it wants a family. So, settle in. Get comfortable. Let the storm outside fade. Let your breathing slow. Let the night wrap around you like a blanket pulled gently to your chin. And remember, if you hear something moving in your room tonight, don't turn on the light. Don't pull the covers back. Don't open your eyes just yet. It's only the stories. And they've been waiting for you. Welcome to Little Dream. The Midnight Express. Maya always told herself she wasn't afraid of the night, and most nights she believed it. She walked home after late shifts, sat alone in diners past midnight, and took whatever bus happened to be running. But the N14 was different. It didn't bother to hide its oddness the way other night routes did. It just existed, the same way a shadow exists, quietly, patiently, without asking for permission. That night, shortly past 2:07 a.m., Maya found herself at the edge of a half-lit bus stop on a street that felt abandoned even by the fog that smothered the city every evening. The street lamps glowed weakly through the haze, halos of gold trembling in the heavy air like lanterns underwater. The world was still, too still, the kind of stillness that happens only when everything living has already decided to sleep. Maya sat on the cold metal bench, hugging her backpack to her chest, listening to the distant hum of a city that should have been louder. Nothing moved. No cars, no footsteps, no late-night cyclists hurrying home. Even the fog seemed to pause and hold its breath. She checked her phone. 1% battery. No service. The red icon pulsed in the corner of the screen before fading, replaced by the empty silence of a black display. She sighed and slid the phone into her pocket. Her shift had run late again, and all she wanted was to get home, crawl under her blanket, and forget the world existed. Her eyes burned from fatigue. Her mind floated between waking and dreaming, thoughts dissolving the moment they formed. When she blinked, the fog seemed to shift closer, creeping along the street as if curious about her. She rubbed her arms, trying to warm herself. The night was too cold for August. Then, far down the street, she heard it, the faint rumble of an engine. Low. Slow. Almost subterranean. She sat up straight, peering into the long tunnel of fog that swallowed the road. Headlights glowed faintly in the distance, as if 2 fireflies were drifting toward her, small at first, then growing larger, brighter, more defined. They cut through the fog in near-perfect symmetry, floating forward like the eyes of some mechanical creature gliding above the pavement. The N14. Maya felt a wave of relief. Finally. The bus approached without the usual clatter of city buses. No sputtering exhaust, no vibrating windows, no hiss of brakes. It simply arrived. Smooth. Soundless. Practically gliding toward the stop. It came to a halt in front of her with a gentle lurch, the fog curling around its frame like pale fingers reluctant to let it go. The doors didn't open at first. They just stood there, shut tight, as if the bus itself were deciding whether to accept her. Maya frowned, shifting her weight, wondering if maybe the route was ending early. Then, with a faint metallic click, the doors folded open. Cold air spilled out, far colder than the summer night should have allowed, brushing past her skin with a damp, almost subterranean chill, like the breath of a tunnel deep underground. She hesitated. Something felt wrong. Buses were warm inside. Bright. Safe. This one was dim, its interior lit only by a few flickering bulbs overhead. The aisles stretched back like a narrow throat, lined with empty seats. Except for 3 figures sitting in the very rear. Maya froze. The trio sat perfectly still, side by side, not looking at her, not at anything. Each wore what appeared to be a uniform, dark coats, pale collars, but the details blurred in the flickering light. They faced forward, back straight, heads tilted at identical angles. Their stillness was so complete it seemed sculpted. "Don't be dramatic," she told herself. "Night buses attract weird people." She stepped up into the bus, gripping the handrail. The moment her foot crossed the threshold, the overhead lights dimmed slightly, humming in a low, almost inaudible frequency. The doors closed behind her with a soft thud that felt final, like a lock sliding shut. The driver didn't greet her. Didn't look at her. Didn't even move. He sat hunched forward, cap low, shoulders stiff, hands gripping the wheel in a rigid, unnatural way, too rigid, as though his joints refused to bend. Maya swallowed, uneasy. She tapped her card. The machine didn't beep, didn't flash, didn't even register her attempt. Instead, it emitted a thin, tired sigh of static. She gave up and headed to a seat halfway down the aisle. As she walked past the middle rows, she kept her eyes forward, refusing to look at the trio in the back. Something about them made her neck prickle. She could feel the weight of their presence pressing gently against her awareness, heavy and oppressive, even though they didn't so much as twitch. The bus pulled away from the curb with a slow, steady motion, no engine growl, no revving, just a soft rise in vibration through the metal floor. Maya gripped the edge of her seat, glancing out the window. They passed her usual stop. And the next. And the next. The fog thickened around the bus, turning the windows into murky mirrors where her reflection quivered faintly. She leaned closer, trying to make out landmarks, but everything beyond the glass was swallowed by white haze. She could still feel the cold from earlier, as if the bus were refrigerated. When she finally mustered the courage to speak, her voice came out small. "Excuse me," she said, directing the words toward the driver. "No stops yet." The driver didn't respond. Didn't nod. Didn't breathe, as far as she could tell. Maya frowned and tried again. "Hey, sorry, can you tell me when?" Her voice cut off. Literally. Her mouth moved, her throat vibrated, but no sound came out. Not even a whisper. Like the air around her swallowed her words before they left her lips. She touched her throat, panic rising. She opened her mouth again, nothing. The lights flickered overhead in a long, slow stutter, like they were reacting to her silence. She grabbed her phone out of instinct. Black screen. Dead. She pressed the power button. Nothing. With trembling fingers, she opened the GPS app anyway, desperate for any sense of location. No signal. No coordinates. Just a blank screen, and then, for a fraction of a second, an image. The bus icon sliding off the edge of the map, into a gray void where no roads existed. Maya's chest tightened. She turned to look back toward the rear seats. The trio had shifted. Not much, just enough that she knew they hadn't been sitting like that before. Their hands, once resting in their laps, now hung over the edge of the seat in loose, limp angles. Their heads were slightly lower. Their uniforms looked wrong, too loose, almost draped, like cloth wrapped around something that wasn't shaped quite like a person. Their fabric glistened faintly, as though damp. Burial shrouds, she thought, unbidden. A breath she didn't remember taking caught painfully in her throat. The temperature dropped sharply, enough that she could see her breath fog against the cold interior. The windows began to frost around the edges, delicate patterns unfurling like frozen veins. A faint drip sound echoed through the bus, as if water were falling from some unseen place. Maya gripped the seat in front of her. The bus slowed. Not at a stop, not anywhere normal. She could feel it. The route was wrong. The motion was wrong. The fog outside wasn't parting, it was swallowing. The bus was entering somewhere. Or something. The lights dimmed again, plunging the aisle into a murky half-darkness. Maya tried to stand, but her legs felt numb, cold spreading upward like her nerves were frostbitten. Her breath came out in quick clouds. Her heart hammered so loud she thought the trio in the back must hear it. She looked toward the driver again. He shifted. Just slightly. Enough for her to see that his lower body wasn't there. His torso hovered rigidly behind the wheel, no movement of legs, no outline of hips. Just a shadow where the rest should have been. Maya's stomach dropped. The bus groaned, metal straining under some invisible pressure. The fog outside grew so thick it pressed against the windows like hands. And somewhere behind her. A sound. A soft, synchronized inhale. Coming from the trio in the back. Maya's entire body went cold. The bus was slowing. And she did not want to know what the stop would be. She lunged toward the emergency latch, fingers stiff, breath fogging wildly as she fumbled with the metal lever. The latch screeched, a sharp metallic cry splitting the icy air. The bus jerked. The trio exhaled in unison, a low, damp hiss that made her blood freeze. Maya threw her shoulder into the window. It shattered outward. Fog swallowed her. And she leapt from the bus into whatever waited outside. Maya hit the ground harder than she expected, the impact knocking the breath out of her lungs as the cold, wet grass scraped against her palms, and for a moment she lay there disoriented, blinking into the heavy fog that swallowed everything more than a few feet away. The world seemed flattened, muted, as though sound itself was hesitant to move through the air. She pushed herself upright slowly, her limbs trembling, her breath emerging in thin white streams that curled upward and vanished. The bus loomed behind her as a dim, rectangular shadow, its interior lights flickering through the cracked window she had broken, but she could no longer see the trio in the back or the driver, only vague silhouettes and the faint impression of movement inside, like shapes shifting behind thick ice. The ground felt wrong under her feet, too soft in places, too uneven in others, as if she were standing in a field that hadn't been touched by human hands in decades. She turned, squinting through the fog, trying to discern any landmarks, any road signs, any indication of where the bus had taken her, but the darkness pressed close, thick and heavy, offering no details beyond the pale blur of her own breath. Behind her, the bus made a sound, a low, trembling hum that vibrated through the air like a deep mechanical sigh. She froze, turning her head slowly toward it. The silhouette of the vehicle shifted slightly, the headlights dimming, then brightening unnaturally, as though responding to her presence in some slow, sentient way. For one sickening moment, she thought the doors might open again, that the bus might try to reclaim her, but instead the entire machine seemed to contract, as if inhaling deeply, before the hum dropped in pitch and the bus began to move. It rolled forward without turning, drifting straight into the fog like a phantom gliding over water, the wheels barely disturbing the earth. As it accelerated, its taillights flickered once, then vanished entirely, swallowed by the endless gray. Maya stood alone in the silence it left behind. The cold seeped into her bones, numbing her legs and stiffening her fingers, and she hugged her arms around herself, turning in a slow circle as she tried to understand the shape of the land around her. There was nothing. No houses. No street lamps. No sound of distant traffic. Only fog draped across a wide, open field, stretching so far and so uniformly that she couldn't tell where the land ended and the sky began. Even the air felt wrong, tasting faintly metallic, as though the atmosphere itself had forgotten how to breathe properly. She forced her legs to move, taking careful steps through the grass, which reached almost to her knees in uneven patches. Somewhere ahead, she imagined she could feel the faintest suggestion of a path, something slightly flattened beneath her feet, but it was impossible to see clearly, and each step carried her deeper into the suffocating fog. Her heartbeat sounded unnaturally loud in her ears, rapid and frantic, like a trapped bird fluttering against its cage. She called out once, testing her voice, since it had vanished on the bus, but the sound that escaped was barely audible, a faint, cracked whisper swallowed immediately by the mist. Still, it was something. She tried again, louder this time, but her voice felt restrained, like the air thickening around her stole the force of her words mid-breath. She needed to find a road. A direction. Anything. As she walked, her eyes adjusted slightly to the dimness, and she began to make out faint textures in the fog, shadows that might have been trees, or fences, or simply illusions crafted by her tired mind. She kept moving, focusing on her breathing, on the cold burn of air filling her lungs. After several minutes, maybe 20, maybe only 5, time felt slippery here. Something darkened in the distance. A shape. A vertical line cutting through the gray. She quickened her pace. It was a telephone pole, old, weathered, leaning slightly to one side, with frayed wires stretching from its top into the fog. She reached it and touched the rough wood, grounding herself in something solid. Relief flooded through her so sharply it hurt. She followed the direction of the wires with her eyes, searching for the next pole, and after a moment she spotted it, another faint silhouette in the distance. Good. A line meant a road. Eventually. She walked toward the next pole, then the next, following the invisible path they traced across the field. The fog thickened around her ankles, swirling like pale smoke. Occasionally she heard faint noises, soft rustling sounds, like fabric brushing against grass, or like someone exhaling behind her, but every time she turned, there was nothing. Just fog. The further she walked, the more she began to notice a strange pattern. The poles were spaced unevenly. Some stood only a few yards apart, others were set at odd distances, leaning toward or away from one another in awkward, unnatural angles, as if something had moved them over time, rearranging them for reasons unknown. She tried not to think about that. She needed to stay focused. Her breath formed small clouds as she kept walking, following the telephone line deeper into the unknown. But the sense of direction remained elusive, everything blending together in shades of gray and black. After what felt like another long stretch of time, she realized the ground beneath her feet had changed, no longer soft grass, but something firmer, grittier. Dirt. A path. Finally. She crouched, touching the ground. The surface felt cold and damp, with deep grooves carved into the earth, parallel lines, like tire tracks. Maybe a maintenance vehicle. Or the bus. No. These tracks were too old, too eroded, as if they'd been made years ago and hadn't been disturbed since. A faint wind stirred, carrying with it a low, distant sound. A hum. A vibration. Like the engine of a large vehicle idling somewhere behind the fog. Maya straightened slowly, her heart tightening. She held her breath, listening. The sound grew slightly louder, still distant but unmistakably mechanical. For a moment she feared the Midnight Express had circled back, hunting her through the mist, but this hum felt different, slower, more broken, like something old and exhausted struggling to stay alive. She followed the path cautiously, each step quiet against the dirt. The hum grew louder, louder, until the fog ahead flickered with a faint orange glow. She approached with slow, measured breaths, her pulse racing as the light brightened, illuminating the outline of a bus stop sign. Not a modern one. An old, rusted metal post with a rectangular plaque at the top, half caked in dirt and rust, barely legible in the faint glow. She brushed the grime away. N14. Last stop. Her breath caught in her throat. The hum behind the fog grew louder, and she realized with dawning horror that the light wasn't from the sign, it was from something behind it, something large and rectangular, something idling just out of sight. The bus. It had returned. But as the fog thinned momentarily in a small breeze, she saw the shape more clearly, and froze. It wasn't the same bus. This one was older, much older, its windows cracked, its frame sagging, its paint peeling in thick, mottled patches. A long streak of mud ran down one side. Several windows were missing. And yet it hummed, engine rumbling faintly, alive despite its decay. Maya took a step back. The bus lights flickered once, as though noticing her. A shape moved inside, just a silhouette, leaning slowly forward as if trying to see past the grime. Maya's breath hitched. She turned and ran. The fog swallowed her instantly, but she didn't stop. Her legs burned, her lungs screamed, the cold cut into her skin like needles, but she pushed forward blindly, desperate to outrun whatever world she had fallen into. Behind her, the engine revved, slow at first, then rising like a beast waking. She kept running until the hum faded completely, until the fog around her returned to its silent, suffocating stillness. She collapsed onto the ground, shaking violently. She didn't know how long she sat there, hugging her knees, trying to keep herself from falling apart. Then, a faint sound drifted through the fog. A soft, synchronized sigh. Not from ahead. Not from behind. From somewhere to her left. Very close. Maya's blood ran cold. Something stood in the fog. Something tall. Something unmoving. Something waiting. The trio. Or something like them. She didn't dare breathe. Maya did not turn her head at first, she simply froze, letting the cold seep deeper into her skin until she felt less like a person and more like a shape carved out of ice, gripping the damp earth beneath her as silence pressed around her ears with the soft, suffocating weight of a held breath. The faint synchronized sigh drifted through the fog again, too close, too steady, as if three unseen figures had exhaled at the exact same moment. Her heart pounded so hard she worried the sound itself might give her away, beating loudly against the hollow stillness of the field. Slowly, painfully slowly, she lifted her eyes toward the pale haze at her left. Shapes were beginning to coalesce, three vague silhouettes, standing shoulder to shoulder, utterly motionless. They were not approaching. They were simply there, as though the fog had decided to take human shape for the sake of watching her. Their outlines were wrong, too long in the limbs, too narrow at the waist, their heads tilted at identical angles like marionettes hung from invisible strings. Her breath hitched, but she forced herself to stay quiet, terrified that any sound might prompt them to move. She stared, waiting for some sign of life, some shift or tremor or flicker of recognition, but the figures remained perfectly still, their faintly darker shapes bleeding into the storm of gray around them. She rose slowly from the ground, the dirt clinging to her palms. Her knees trembled beneath her, threatening to collapse, but she locked them rigid and forced herself upright, keeping her movements small, careful, respectful, as though the air between her and the trio might shatter if disturbed. The fog swirled around their legs, drifting in sluggish coils that never quite touched them, almost as if the mist itself was avoiding them. Maya took one step back, then another, feeling the ground slant subtly downward. The trio did not follow. They did not react at all. And perhaps that was worse. She backed away until the shapes were swallowed by the fog, leaving her alone again in a world that felt too empty and too full all at once. She turned toward the telephone poles she had followed earlier. They were faint outlines now, thinning into the dark, but still a direction she could move toward, still something grounded in reality. She took a shaky breath and walked, placing each foot deliberately, as though afraid the earth might give way beneath her. The cold deepened as she moved, building inside her chest like a weight pressing against her lungs. She wrapped her arms around herself but couldn't stop trembling. The field felt different now, as though she had crossed into a pocket of reality that had been kept sealed and forgotten. Even the fog had texture here, dense, almost oily, dragging against her skin. After several minutes of walking, the ground became uneven, rising beneath her feet in a low mound. She stumbled once, catching herself on what she thought was a rock, but when her hand closed around it, she realized with a sick jolt that it was something smooth and cold, like thick glass. She brushed the dirt off with her sleeve. It wasn't glass. It was metal. A curved panel. A fragment of paint, yellowed and cracked, peeled away under her touch, revealing a faded letter beneath. N. Her breath caught. She brushed away more dirt, her fingers trembling, revealing another letter. -1. She jerked her hand back. She was touching a piece of the N14. A piece buried in the earth. Old. Bent. Long abandoned. A sudden sharp sound cracked through the fog, a metallic bang echoing like a door slamming shut deep underground. Maya flinched violently, stumbling back from the metal fragment. The ground beneath her pulsed once, a slow vibration traveling through the soil like something enormous shifting below the surface. She retreated instinctively, her pulse hammering as she tried to understand what she had just touched. How long had that wreck been here? How long had the N14 been running? Was this bus even the same one she had boarded? Or was the Midnight Express older than she thought, far older? A soft ripple of cold air brushed the back of her neck. She spun around. The trio stood behind her. Not close, 10, maybe 15 feet away, but far closer than before. She had not heard them approach. They did not breathe. They did not sway. They simply existed, as though the fog had chosen again to give them form at exactly this new distance. Maya's chest tightened so violently she nearly sank to her knees. Her vision blurred at the edges. Her throat clenched. "No," she whispered, or tried to. The sound came out thin, brittle, barely more than a breath. She stepped backward, but her heel hit another buried fragment of metal, and she lost her balance for an instant. The trio did not advance, but their heads tilted, just slightly, as if they were listening to the way her shoes scraped against the ground. Her instinct to flee overwhelmed everything else. She turned sharply and ran, tripping through the uneven field, stumbling over hidden debris, forcing her legs to move faster even as cold stiffness crawled up her spine like frost forming beneath her skin. The fog was so thick she felt it brushing her lips as she breathed. Her lungs burned. Her limbs ached. The hum she had heard earlier rose again somewhere behind her, deeper, more resonant, as though the ground itself were trying to warn her. She kept running until her legs buckled and she collapsed again, the wet grass cushioning her fall. She crawled forward, desperate to put distance between herself and the trio. When she dared to look back, she could no longer see them. Relief washed over her in a shallow wave that barely grazed the terror underneath. But then she noticed something else, something so quiet she almost missed it. Footsteps. Not loud ones. Not heavy ones. But soft, dragging footsteps, like damp cloth being pulled through tall grass. Slow. Steady. Keeping perfect rhythm with her heartbeat. She scrambled to her feet again, dizzy with panic, turning in frantic circles as she tried to find a direction, any direction, that felt less suffocating. The fog responded like something alive, parting slightly to reveal a narrow path of packed earth leading uphill. She didn't trust it. She didn't trust anything here. But she had no choice. She followed it. The climb was harder than it looked. Her shoes slipped on wet soil. Twisted roots threatened to snare her ankles. The air grew even colder, carrying with it the faint stench of old metal and stagnant water. But something pushed her upward, a distant glow at the top of the hill, weak but unmistakably artificial, like the flicker of a street lamp fighting through the fog. Street lamps meant roads. Roads meant escape. She climbed faster, pulse racing, lungs burning, and when she reached the top she nearly sobbed with relief. A road. A real road. Cracked asphalt stretched before her, faint lines barely visible beneath grime. A single street lamp buzzed overhead, flickering with a pale, jaundiced glow that illuminated a short section of the road before darkness swallowed the rest. Maya stepped onto the asphalt, feeling grounded for the first time since she'd escaped the bus. She walked toward the lamp, letting its weak light wash over her. But then she noticed something. Another bus stop sign. Identical to the one she had found earlier. Old. Rusted. N14. Last stop. Her breath hitched painfully. This wasn't a way out. It was a loop. And as she stood there trembling, the air shifted, mist curling around her legs as the distant hum rose once more. Headlights bloomed through the fog. Approaching from the darkness. Slow. Deliberate. Silent. The Midnight Express was coming back. And Maya realized with growing horror that she was no longer being taken somewhere. She was being collected. Maya did not run at first, she simply stood there beneath the flickering street lamp, staring at the approaching headlights as if the light alone might anchor her to something sane, something familiar, something that belonged to the world she had woken up in that morning, but the glow that broke through the fog wasn't warm or safe or even remotely alive. It looked like two pale eyes drifting forward in a skull made of mist, widening slowly as the hum of the engine deepened into the kind of low, deliberate vibration that could be felt more than heard, a resonance that trembled faintly through the asphalt beneath her feet. She wanted to believe it was another vehicle, any other vehicle, a maintenance van, an old truck, a normal night bus, but the way the lights moved was wrong, too smooth, too steady, floating toward her with the patience of something that already knew she had nowhere else left to go. The fog thickened around her knees, rising in slow spirals, brushing her skin with a cold that felt almost sentient. That was when instinct finally overrode shock. Her legs jerked into motion, stumbling backward along the cracked asphalt as the hulking silhouette of the bus grew sharper, its frame yawning through the fog like a ship cutting through dark waters. The street lamp above her flickered violently, buzzing in protest as though the light itself were afraid of whatever approached. Maya's breath hitched, turning grainy and thin in her throat, and she staggered backward, one step, then two, before turning sharply and running down the road, her shoes slapping against the wet asphalt. But she hadn't taken more than a dozen steps before she felt it, the impossible shift of the ground beneath her, a subtle tilt, a bending, like reality itself was rearranging to guide her back toward the thing rolling steadily out of the fog. She stumbled, nearly falling, and caught her balance only by grabbing the warped metal pole of the bus stop sign. A rush of cold wind swept past her, carrying with it a sharp, metallic scent, and when she lifted her eyes toward the direction she'd come from, her heart buckled in her chest. More silhouettes stood in the fog, 3 figures at first, then 4, then 7, spaced evenly along the road, all perfectly still, their heads angled toward her the way a row of mannequins in a shuttered store window might seem to watch a passerby. Maya's breath shuddered. She stepped onto the narrow strip of gravel beside the road, pushing through the overgrown weeds, looking for any possible path that might break free of the suffocating fog, but the grasses seemed to shift subtly around her legs, tugging, brushing, resisting, as if the landscape itself did not agree with her choice. Somewhere deep behind her, the engine of the bus gave a long, hungry rumble. She turned back just in time to see the headlights swell into clarity, revealing the front of the same impossible vehicle that had collected her at the deserted stop earlier that night, but now its destination display, once blank, was flickering, struggling to form letters, glowing faintly through layers of condensation clinging to the inside of the panel. Her stomach knotted. Slowly, haltingly, the letters glowed into life. N14. Returning. Her legs went numb. Returning. Returning where? Returning what? The bus let out a soft hiss, not the mechanical sigh of hydraulics, but something almost organic, a slow exhale like breath escaping from between unseen teeth. Maya felt her throat tighten so violently she could barely swallow. She backed away again, stepping onto the cracked paint of the road's faded centerline. Then she heard it. Footsteps behind her, soft, dragging, slightly out of sync, as if several people were wading through the fog, not with urgency, but with quiet inevitability. She turned her head slowly, and through the thick white haze, she saw them, the trio. Or something wearing the memory of the trio. They stood not 20 feet away, their silhouettes more defined now, the outlines of their bodies warped under loose, damp fabric that clung to them like burial shrouds soaked in earth. The fog brushed their legs but never seemed to touch their clothing. Their heads were angled forward, not at her exactly, but toward the waiting bus, as if something inside it were pulling them home. And then, impossibly, they moved. Not stepping. Not walking. They shifted, their positions jumping slightly, like frames in a corrupted video file. One moment they were several feet away, the next, they were closer, their outlines trembling at the edges. Maya bolted, sprinting down the road in the opposite direction, heart hammering in her chest as the silhouettes blurred behind her. But the road did not behave like a road. The fog ahead thickened into impenetrable white, swallowing every step she took, and before she realized what was happening, she saw the flicker of the same street lamp she'd just escaped, buzzing weakly above the same cracked asphalt, leaning over the same rusted bus stop sign. She had looped. She didn't know how. She didn't know why. But she had looped. The bus was now only a few yards away. It idled patiently beside the sign, doors closed, headlights staring directly at her like unblinking eyes. The hum of its engine vibrated through her ribs. She backed away, shaking her head, whispering, "No," even though no sound came out. Her voice had deserted her again. The trio stood behind her. The bus stood in front of her. And the road on either side had collapsed into blank, unbreakable fog. She was trapped in a fixed point on a route that refused to let her leave. The bus doors opened with a soft, wet gasp. A gust of air spilled out, bitterly cold and damp, smelling faintly of moss, rust, and something older, something that reminded her of church basements or long-abandoned tunnels where air had been waiting too long. She shook violently, her body instinctively rejecting the scent even as her legs threatened to buckle. Then she saw the driver. He was not sitting as before. He was standing in the aisle, half turned toward the door, as if he had anticipated her arrival. The flickering overhead light illuminated only the upper portion of his body, the low cap pulled over his face, the stiff collar hugging his neck, the shoulders too rigid, too squared, but everything below his waist was simply not there, not absent. Not invisible. Not shadowed. Gone. The lower half of his body ended in a ragged, wavering blur, as if the air itself had been torn open and something had excised him from the waist down. His hands, still gloved, curled slightly at his sides, twitching in staccato bursts like a puppet struggling to reset to its last instructed pose. Maya staggered backward, but her heel met resistance, a soft thud, and she turned with a strangled breath to see that the trio had closed the distance again. They stood inches behind her now, their heads tilted so far forward she could almost feel their breath, if the dead breathed. The bus hummed louder. The headlights pulsed. And through the fog-choked silence, a whisper drifted toward her, faint, ancient, soaked in the weight of long-forgotten passengers. Bored. The word didn't come from the driver. It came from everywhere, from the fog, from the asphalt, from the buried wreck beneath the field, from the trio behind her, from the place the Midnight Express had been born. It vibrated through the bones of the world. Maya dropped to her knees, clutching the ground, shaking from head to toe. She didn't know if she should fight or submit or cry or scream. But the bus doors stayed open, waiting. The trio leaned closer. The fog thickened like a closing fist. And Maya understood, in a sickening flash, that the Midnight Express didn't take people to a destination. It made them one. Maya didn't remember standing. One moment she was on her knees, trembling so violently her teeth clicked together, and the next she was being pulled, not physically, not by hands, but by an almost gravitational tug, a sort of pressure beneath the skin that guided her steps toward the open doors of the Midnight Express, as though something inside the heart of the bus had recognized her, claimed her, marked her as part of its route the moment she stepped aboard hours ago. The fog tightened around her like a soft, icy sheath, pressing against her clothes and shoulders, guiding her down the cracked asphalt with the gentle insistence of a tide ushering driftwood back to shore. She tried to resist, truly she did, but her limbs felt distant, her muscles slowed, as though the cold had seeped into her bones and rewired them. Every step felt less like a choice and more like the bus had already decided she belonged inside it. She turned her head in a desperate, pleading search for escape, but the silhouettes of the trio stood inches behind her again, their outlines clearer now, fleshless planes beneath sagging shrouds, shoulders sloped with the heaviness of earth, their heads tilted toward the open doors as if encouraging her onward, escorting her back to her seat like attendants ushering a reluctant soul through the final threshold. The driver's upper half twitched in the aisle, spasming in small, jerky motions that made his shadow on the back wall tremble like a puppet glitching mid-mechanical cycle. The bus hummed louder, its engine vibrating with a low, subterranean resonance that made the asphalt beneath her tremble, a vibration that traveled upward through her feet and into her ribs, sinking with her heartbeat until she wasn't sure which pulse belonged to whom. She felt herself step closer, the cold breath of the vehicle spilling over her like a draft from a tomb opening for the first time in centuries. When she reached the metal lip of the entrance, she forced her hand against the frame, digging her nails into the chilled surface as if anchoring herself could stop the inevitable. Her breath fogged so heavily she could barely see the steps. "Please," she tried to say, but the fog swallowed her voice again, the world refused to hear her. She squeezed her eyes shut, willing her legs not to move, willing her body to remain her own for even one more second. But the cold was sinking deeper, blooming through her chest in a slow, spreading numbness that softened every instinct she had left. She opened her eyes, slowly, reluctantly, and her reflection stared back at her in the glass of the bus window. Except it wasn't her reflection at all. The face looking back was her face, yes, but not as she remembered it. It was too pale, too hollow, too still. Her eyes were sunken, her hair damp as though she had been lying in the earth for days. Her reflection didn't mimic her trembling. It didn't share her panic. It simply watched, expression blank, waiting. And when she flinched away, the reflection lifted its hand in a slow, silent greeting. Something inside Maya broke. She stumbled backward off the step, gasping as air finally surged back into her lungs. The trio behind her twitched in response, their heads jerking in small, unnatural spasms, like the static-laced motions of a corrupted video file. The driver's torso snapped upright, cap still shadowing his face, but she felt his attention lock onto her with the force of a cold hand gripping the back of her neck. The bus let out a low groan, a sound like metal deforming deep underwater, and the engine revved once, long and slow, the roar laced with something like disappointment. Maya turned and fled down the road, slipping on the wet asphalt as the fog ripped past her, stinging her cheeks. She didn't look back. She didn't dare. The sound of the engine built behind her, growing louder, sharper, deeper, the hum transforming into the rolling growl of a machine shedding its restraints. Her lungs burned with frozen air. Her legs screamed. She felt dizzy, lightheaded, like the world around her was tilting, folding, swallowing itself. But she kept running. She didn't know how long she ran, maybe minutes, maybe hours, but the darkness eventually began to peel away. The fog thinned, the air warmed by the slightest fraction, and a faint glow emerged ahead like the first weak suggestion of a sunrise. Her chest tightened with hope. She pushed herself forward, legs shaking, vision narrowing around that fragile pinprick of light. It grew brighter. Warmer. Closer. She could hear the whisper of wind. She could almost smell the damp asphalt of a real city street, could almost sense the familiar hum of traffic in the distance. She stumbled toward it, arms outstretched, ready to collapse into whatever safety the world still had left for her. And then the light flickered. Not like a sunrise. Like a street lamp. A single, fragile street lamp buzzing overhead. The fog parted. And she found herself standing at a bus stop, the same one. The same rusted sign. The same cracked bench. The same halo of pale yellow light cutting through a wall of fog. Her knees buckled, and she fell forward, clawing at the pavement in disbelief. No, she tried to say, but the fog stole her words before they formed. Her breath formed a trembling cloud in front of her. She forced herself to look down the street. Headlights. Drifting through the fog. Slow. Steady. Patient. The hum vibrated through the ground, rising like a memory repeating itself with perfect fidelity. It was 2:07 a.m. again. Or maybe it had always been. The bus glided toward her, silent as a held breath, its destination display flickering weakly. Maya pushed herself to her feet, stumbling backward until she hit the metal bench. The cold dug into her spine. She pressed her hands over her mouth, stifling a sob. She knew what would happen. She had already seen it. Already lived it. She squeezed her eyes shut. But behind her eyelids, she didn't see darkness. She saw the trio, sitting in the back of the bus. Still. Waiting. Their shrouds damp, their heads tilted in that identical angle of patient anticipation. Waiting for her seat to be filled. The bus slid to a stop. The doors opened with a soft, welcoming sigh. The night held its breath. And in that moment, horribly, clearly, Maya understood what the Midnight Express truly was. Not a bus. Not a route. Not even a vehicle. A ritual. A cycle. A collection of the lost who never made it home, forever looping through the fog-laden hours of a night that didn't end. Passengers who became part of the route, part of the silence, part of the fog itself. The bus didn't take people somewhere. It kept them. Preserved them. Returned for them. Again and again. A faint whisper drifted from the open doors, soft as settling dust. Bored. The fog curled around her ankles like a gentle hand. And Maya, exhausted, broken, no longer sure where her body ended and the cold began, felt herself take that one last step forward. As the doors folded shut, sealing her inside, the bus lights flickered once. The engine hummed. The Midnight Express pulled away into the fog, the trio in the back straightening as one to welcome their newest passenger. And the road behind them faded back into silence. Waiting for its next name. The cedar chest of unmaking. Elias Holden arrived at the edge of the old farmhouse just after dusk, the gravel crunching under his tires as the car rolled to a stop beside the leaning porch, and for a long moment he simply sat there with his hands resting on the steering wheel, letting the engine tick into silence as the Vermont evening folded itself around him. The sky was still holding on to the last pale streaks of blue, though the encroaching woods pressed in dark and close, and the wind carried with it the crisp scent of cedar and wet earth from the forest beyond the property line. Elias wasn't sure if the tightness in his chest was grief, relief, or exhaustion. 2 months ago he'd been living in a downtown apartment with too many memories of a relationship that had collapsed like soggy cardboard, and now he was here, staring at a house he barely remembered his uncle owning, a house that felt more like a stranger than an inheritance. He stepped out into the soft creaking hush of the country evening, the grass bending under his boots, and the farmhouse seemed to inhale at his presence, the porch board settling, the window panes flexing as the cool air shifted, as if the whole structure had been waiting for the sound of footsteps again. Inside, dust motes hung suspended in the fading light like bits of ash drifting lazily through a forgotten cathedral. Elias set down his bag and walked through the rooms, each space echoing back his presence with the hollow timbre of a place unused to new occupants. He touched the counter in the kitchen, the handle of the old oak banister, the cold metal frame of the bed upstairs, trying to imagine his uncle here, the life he'd led, the quiet solitude he'd chosen. The house smelled faintly of cedar and old linens, a comforting scent that seeped into his clothes as though welcoming him gently but insistently. He found the note on the dining table, just a simple envelope with his name written in a shaky hand. Inside, the deed, a small key, and a single line written in pencil. "The attic's yours now. Take care of what's inside. No explanation. No instructions. No warning. Elias pocketed the key and climbed the narrow staircase to the attic, each step groaning beneath his weight, the air growing cooler and denser with every foot he gained. At the top, he paused, feeling an odd pressure in his ears, the strange hush of a room that had been sealed for a long time. He pushed open the door. The attic smelled strongly of cedar, stronger than anywhere else in the house, sweet and earthy. Dust-coated rafters angled above him like the ribs of some great slumbering creature, and beneath them, half hidden under a canvas sheet, sat an old cedar chest. It was beautiful. Not elegant in a refined, expensive way, but beautiful in its craftsmanship, the wood grained deep and swirling, the surface smooth and warm to the touch even through layers of dust, the metal hinges dark with age but unbroken. Elias knelt beside it, brushing the dust from the lid as though greeting an old friend, and when he pressed the key into the small brass lock, it clicked open with a soft sound like a held breath released. The lid lifted easily, despite its weight, and a rich wave of cedar scent washed out into the room, so strong it was almost intoxicating. Inside, there wasn't much. A folded length of linen. A small, carved wooden object resting on top. A kuksa. A simple, crude drinking cup, the kind crafted by hand from a single piece of birch or alder. It was unevenly carved, the surface rough, as though the maker had been either inexperienced or impatient. Elias turned it over in his hands, noticing the slight discolorations along the inside rim, the way the handle seemed shaped for a grip not quite his own. There was something undeniably comforting about it, something warm, familiar, even though he was certain he had never seen it before in his life. A cup. In a cedar chest. Left for him. He almost laughed at the anticlimax of it. After all the tension of arriving, the weight of the silence, the note from his uncle hinting at something meaningful, a cup. But Elias was a practical man, and the cup felt sturdy, well-balanced. He tucked it under his arm and carried it downstairs, placing it on the counter while he rummaged through the kitchen cabinets for coffee supplies left behind. He found a tin of grounds, miraculously unspoiled, and set water to boil. He washed the kuksa gently, though the wood absorbed the water greedily, darkening as though thirsting. When the coffee was ready, he poured a small amount into the cup. The scent was different somehow, richer, deeper, as if the cedar of the kuksa infused the drink with a subtle sweetness. He lifted it to his lips. It tasted perfect. A warmth spread through his chest, a loosening beneath his ribs, a sense of being quietly held, reassured. For the first time in months, Elias felt an odd, fragile peace settle into him. He slept deeply that night. When he woke the next morning, he found his tools neatly organized in the shed despite having left them scattered. His shirts, which he distinctly remembered having pushed into a suitcase, were folded carefully at the foot of his bed. His phone, tangled in a cord when he went to sleep, now lay beside the charger, arranged neatly. He brushed it off as his own distracted routine, the after effects of exhaustion, the habits of someone trying to rebuild a life. But the house vibrated faintly beneath him, like the earth exhaling, and the scent of cedar followed him from room to room. He poured coffee into the kuksa again, and that feeling, that warmth, that quiet certainty of being cared for, returned. It didn't feel intrusive. It didn't feel wrong. It felt like presence. As though the house, or something in it, appreciated him. Watched him. Kept him. That night, as he sat on the porch listening to the faint creak sounds in the distance, the cup rested beside him on the wooden railing, and he could swear, only faintly, only briefly, that the cedar chest shifted upstairs, its lid settling deeper in the silence like a sleeper turning in bed. He didn't worry. Not yet. Elias woke the next morning to the soft, steady sound of rain brushing against the farmhouse windows, a thin, rustling whisper that threaded itself through the early daylight like a lullaby, and as he rolled out of bed he felt an unusual clarity in his body, a rested lightness he hadn't known in years. His back didn't ache, his jaw wasn't clenched, and the usual heaviness behind his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, almost childlike stillness. He blinked against the dim light, stretching as he shuffled toward the kitchen, and for a fleeting moment he felt watched, not in a threatening way, but in the way a pet watches its owner wake, waiting patiently for movement. It made him smile, strangely. The house had always felt cold and hollow when he first arrived, but now it seemed warmer, aware of his presence, like old floorboards and beams were slowly exhaling after years of tension. He scooped coffee into the kettle, poured water, and reached instinctively for the carved kuksa resting on the counter. The wood felt warm in his grip, almost soft at the edges, as though it had grown accustomed to the shape of his hand overnight. He poured coffee into it, inhaling the rich cedar-sweet aroma, and the moment he took a sip he felt something settle into him, a subtle thread pulling tight through his center, comforting, grounding, familiar. He carried the cup with him as he walked through the house, surveying the rooms he planned to fix up. The dining room windows needed replacing. A cracked beam in the hallway had to be reinforced. He opened the shed for tools and froze mid-step. His toolbox had been reorganized perfectly. The wrenches arranged in ascending size. The screwdrivers polished clean and nestled neatly in their compartments. The hammer placed precisely parallel to the measuring tape, their handles aligned. He stared for a long moment, trying to remember if he had done this last night in a fog of exhaustion, but the careful, almost reverent precision of the arrangement didn't feel like his work. He touched one of the wrenches, cool metal meeting his fingertips, and the faint scent of cedar rose from the handle, impossibly, inexplicably out of place. He frowned, stepping back, blinking as though the seam might rearrange itself into something more reasonable. But the tools remained still, quietly organized, quietly waiting. Throughout the day, more small things revealed themselves. A shirt he thought he had forgotten to unpack was draped neatly over the back of a chair. His muddy boots from yesterday's walk were wiped clean and set beside the door. The cluttered stack of mail he had ignored was sorted by size on the table. A loose floorboard he'd meant to fix no longer creaked. At first, he chalked it up to the adrenaline of moving, the way the mind blurs details when overwhelmed. But as the hours passed, the pattern of care became undeniable. There was intention behind it, a kind of quiet attentiveness that felt almost affectionate. Every time he picked up the kuksa to drink, a faint warmth bloomed through his chest, a presence stirring gently at the edge of awareness, like invisible hands smoothing wrinkles from his shirt or brushing dust from his shoulders. He felt watched, yes, but in the same way a mother watches a sleeping child, protective, possessive, and profoundly tender. By evening, the scent of cedar seemed stronger, threading through the house like a soft, sweet fog. The walls felt closer, comforting. The air warmer. Elias found himself humming unconsciously as he moved through the kitchen, the kuksa set beside him on the counter like a loyal pet keeping time with his steps. He had never been a man who enjoyed living alone. Silence usually gnawed at him, but tonight, for the first time, the silence felt companionable. Full. Held. He ate dinner, washed his plate, and as he turned to dry it, the kuksa shifted ever so slightly on the counter, as though nudged by a small, unseen hand. He froze. The movement was tiny. Barely perceptible. But it was movement. He stared at the cup for several long seconds, breath shallow. There was no draft, the windows were shut. The counter was level. No vibration from appliances. Nothing that could have nudged it. He reached out, touched it gingerly. Warm. Warmer than it had any reason to be. He swallowed, his throat tight, and whispered, without thinking. "Thank you." The warmth pulsed gently beneath his fingers, almost like a heartbeat. The house settled around him with a soft creak, as though pleased. For the first time all day, something inside him whispered caution. But it whispered too softly, drowned out by the relief of being cared for after so long, by the ache in him that sought comfort anywhere it could root. So he drank a final sip of coffee from the kuksa and went to bed early. He slept heavily. And he dreamed of cedar forests, of soft hands smoothing his hair, of being held by something vast and formless but deeply devoted. A presence that whispered in a language older than sound. He woke near midnight with the sensation of fingers brushing his cheek. When he sat up, startled, no one was there, but the kuksa sat on the table beside the bed, though he distinctly remembered leaving it in the kitchen. The faint scent of cedar was thick around it, curling through the air like incense. He didn't remember falling back asleep. The next morning, the house had cleaned itself again. His laundry, left on the floor, was folded in a neat stack. The mud he tracked into the entryway was gone. The windows had been wiped clear of smudges. Even the loose nail in the hallway baseboard had been hammered flush with perfect precision. Elias moved through the rooms in a daze, one hand wrapped around the kuksa, which felt warm as a living thing in his palm. He murmured again, "Thank you." The warmth deepened. Later that day, Sarah arrived, bright, messy-haired, sarcastic Sarah, the first person Elias had let into his life since the breakup. She brought fresh bread and that easy laughter of hers that always unraveled knots inside him. They walked through the farmhouse together, Elias explaining the repairs he planned, showing her the attic, the shed, the fields. She teased him gently about the cedar smell, like you're living inside a wooden jewelry box, but in her eyes, he saw a real affection. Real interest. Real possibility. Until she reached the kitchen. Her expression tightened instantly. "What's that?" she asked, gesturing toward the counter. Elias followed her gaze. The kuksa sat exactly where he'd left it, but something about it seemed different now, darker in color, the wood grain pulsing faintly under the light, as though illuminated from within. He felt a protective clutch in his chest, a sudden need to defend it. He forced himself to speak lightly. "Just a cup. Old, hand-carved. Found it in the cedar chest upstairs." Sarah didn't smile. She moved closer, brow furrowing, her body language shifting from curiosity to unease. She reached out to touch it, hesitated, then pulled her hand back with a small shiver, as if the air around it had stung her. "I don't like it," she murmured. Elias laughed under his breath, but it came out forced. "It's a cup, Sarah." She shook her head. "It feels wrong. I don't know why. It just does." She reached forward again abruptly, grabbing a dish towel, and wrapped it around the kuksa. Elias's stomach twisted. "Let's just put this away. Somewhere." "No," Elias said sharply. He didn't mean to. He didn't plan it. The word tore from him like a reflexive spasm. Sarah blinked at him, startled. "What?" "Elias, relax. I'm not throwing it out, I just..." "No," his voice was deeper, rougher. His hands trembled. "Don't touch it." A cold gust rolled through the kitchen, raising the fine hairs along his arms. The scent of cedar thickened, coiling around them both like a tightening noose. Sarah stepped back, unsettled. "Okay," she whispered slowly. "Okay. I won't touch it." But the energy in the house shifted. Darkening. Focusing. Listening. Something jealous and ancient stirred in the cedar-scented quiet. Elias felt it move. Not in the walls. Not in the floorboards. Not in the air. Inside him. A low, thrumming warmth. Possessive. Hungry. Mine. Sarah wrapped her arms around herself, glancing at the attic stairs as though something might appear there. "Let's go outside," she said softly. "Get some air." Elias tried to nod, to follow, but the kuksa pulsed in his hand, once, sharply, as though warning him not to leave. And deep in the house, somewhere behind the boards and beams and inherited memories, something unseen shifted with the unmistakable sound of settling bones. Elias didn't remember falling asleep that night, only the gentle weight of Sarah's hand on his forearm as she quietly suggested they take a walk, step outside, let the cool Vermont dusk calm whatever strange tension had curled itself through the kitchen earlier. He remembered agreeing, or thinking he did, but the moment she opened the back door, the scent of cedar rolled through the house in a dense, invisible wave that made the hairs at the back of his neck lift as though brushed by unseen fingers. He blinked once, and the next thing he knew, He was lying in bed fully clothed, the window cracked open to the soft pattering of nighttime creek water far beyond the tree line, the moon low and heavy, the room thick with shadow. His breath fogged faintly in the cold air. Something felt wrong. Not in the house, inside him. His limbs felt distant, as though wrapped in cotton. His heartbeat thudded slow and heavy, like it was pumping through syrup. And then he realized he wasn't lying down anymore. He was standing. He didn't remember standing. He didn't remember getting out of bed. He tried to move, tried to breathe, to gasp, to speak, but his body stood rigid, swaying gently as though controlled by strings that held him upright despite himself. His hands hung loosely at his sides, palms twitching with tiny, involuntary spasms. The farmhouse around him was silent. Deeper than silent, expectant, listening, as though every plank and beam were holding its breath with him. His eyes stared forward, unblinking. He fought to close them and couldn't. His lungs filled and emptied at a rhythm he didn't control. He tried to turn his head but felt resistance, like his neck was no longer his own. Then his feet moved. Not by his choice. A slow, dragging step. Then another. His body lurched forward in stiff, mechanical motions, like a marionette guided by uncertain hands. Inside the prison of his mind, Elias screamed, but nothing left his throat, not even a breath. His hands twitched up toward his chest, then dropped again as though reset. He felt something along his spine, thin, cold tendrils tightening around his nerves, pulling, nudging, steering him gently but insistently toward the hallway. The scent of cedar thickened with every involuntary step he took. The stairs creaked as he descended, slowly, unevenly, each step jarring his bones in the same rhythm as the sharp, small breaths scraping from his chest. Somewhere below, a soft movement caught his ear. The sound of someone shifting under a quilt. Sarah. She had fallen asleep in the guest room after the strange tension earlier, brushing off her unease with a weary laugh. She had kissed his cheek and whispered, "It's just stress, Elias. Houses creak. Old objects feel weird sometimes. Come to bed." She hadn't seen the way the kuksa pulsed faintly in his hand behind his back when she said it, hadn't seen the way the shadows in the attic doorframe seemed to fold inward when she glanced upstairs. His body turned toward her door. Elias begged himself to stop, to resist, to collapse if he had to. But his legs carried him silently to her room, steps stiff as a doll's. He reached the doorway, and his hand that felt like stone attached to his wrist, lifted, hovering near the frame. He inhaled sharply as the fingers twitched of their own accord, curling and uncurling like they were practicing a gesture they had performed before. The room beyond was dim, lit only by a thin wash of moonlight that spilled through the window. Sarah lay sleeping, one arm thrown over the blanket, her breath rising and falling in a soft, peaceful rhythm. His hand moved toward her. He fought with everything he had left, pulling backward inside himself as though trying to wrench his consciousness free from the wires threaded through his limbs, but his body leaned over her, a shadow falling across her sleeping form. His fingers hovered inches from her throat, trembling in unnatural little jerks, as if guided by a puppeteer who knew the destination but not the human mechanics. His breath shuddered. His heart hammered against his ribs, the only part of him still truly alive. And then, right beside his ear, something whispered. A voice cold and dry, like wind brushing through an attic full of old cedar and dust. "Mine. You are only mine." The words slid into him, threading themselves through the back of his skull like hooks. A thin, icy pressure pressed against his neck, almost like a cheek leaning against him, something not quite human nestling close enough that he felt the heat drain from his blood. The scent of cedar deepened until it stung the inside of his nose. His fingers brushed Sarah's shoulder. She stirred, a small sigh escaping her lips, but she didn't wake. The thing inside him tightened its hold. His body shuddered once. Then his fingers began to close. Elias screamed silently inside his own skull, clawing against the invisible grip holding his muscles. A sharp pain shot down his arms, tiny needles drilling into his nerves as the creature or presence or cursed memory inside the kuksa pushed harder, forcing him to continue. But the pain, oddly, helped him. It reminded him of himself, of his bones, of his body, of the distinction between where he ended and the thing began. He forced his hand open just as it began to tighten around Sarah's arm. His fingers spasmed wildly, twitching in violent jerks as the cedar-scented presence fought for control. His knees buckled, sending him crashing to the floor beside the bed, hard enough to jolt the breath from his lungs. The impact broke something loose. Not the possession, not the presence, but its concentration. For one fragile moment, Elias could move enough to drag his body backward, scraping his elbows against the floor as he clawed his way to the hallway. A thin, furious pressure clamped around his ribs, pulling, trying to drag him back toward the sleeping woman in the bed. The whisper grew louder. "Mine." Elias forced his legs to kick, rolling onto his stomach, crawling desperately toward the stairs. Every movement felt like pushing through wet sand. The house moaned around him, the rafters groaning deeply, the old cedar chest upstairs letting out a slow, resonant thud like a heartbeat echoing through the bones of the house. He needed to destroy it. Destroy the kuksa. End whatever had its claws inside him. He tumbled down the last few stairs, caught himself on the railing, then lurched toward the fireplace. Tools rattled on their hooks as he passed, vibrating in a sympathetic rhythm with his pounding heart. He grabbed the kuksa from where it sat on the table. The moment his fingers touched it, a violent shock ripped through his hand, as if something inside the wood had screamed in fury at being held without devotion. His arm jerked, trying to fling it away, or keep it, he couldn't tell which. He gritted his teeth, clutching the cup with both hands even as his muscles spasmed in revolt. He hurled it into the fireplace. The kuksa hit the burning logs with a dull, wooden thud, scattering embers into the air. Flames licked at its sides but didn't blacken it, as though the wood refused to burn. The scent of cedar burst into the room, thick and choking. Elias grabbed the antique axe from beside the hearth. It was heavy, iron-headed, meant for splitting timber. He raised it high, though his arms trembled violently, the presence clawing back inside his nerves. A hiss rose from the fireplace. High-pitched. Feminine. Shrill enough to make his eyes water. Elias roared, not with anger, but with desperation, and brought the axe down. The kuksa cracked. A sound tore through the farmhouse, a sound that did not belong to the living, a scream that rattled every window, every beam, every nail, a long, piercing wail that reverberated through the chimney like the death cry of something that had never been born. The cedar chest upstairs slammed shut with a violent bang. The air trembled. Elias raised the axe again. And again. And again. The kuksa shattered into burning splinters, each crack accompanied by a shriek that grew thinner, weaker, until finally. Suddenly. It stopped. Silence rushed in like a vacuum. The house exhaled. And Elias collapsed to his knees, shaking so hard he barely felt the cold floor beneath him. Behind him, somewhere deep in the timbers of the house, something moved for the last time. Then went still. For a long moment after the final splinter gave way beneath the axe, Elias could only kneel in front of the fireplace, his breath shuddering in uneven bursts as the sickly sweet smell of burning cedar thickened the room into something almost physical, a syrupy haze that clung to his throat and coated the inside of his mouth, making every inhale feel like he was swallowing sap. The flames licked across the shattered fragments of the kuksa, but even as the wood blackened and curled in on itself, the fire behaved strangely, stretching upward as though reaching for something invisible rising from within the broken cup, a faint shimmering distortion that wavered just beyond sight, like heat mirage over desert pavement. Elias stared through the smoke, waiting for another shriek, another violent tremor of the house, another intrusion into his body, but nothing came. The farmhouse, so alive and attentive hours ago, now felt hollow, drained, as though the thing that had inhabited its walls had retreated into the smallest corners of the structure, licking its wounds, clinging to whatever pieces of itself smoldered in the ashes. He lowered the axe slowly, letting its one handle rest against the hearthstone, his arms weak and trembling from exertion and fear. Sweat clung to his forehead despite the cold night air that seeped through the cracks around the window panes. He lifted a shaking hand and pressed it to his temple, wincing as a dull ache pulsed behind his eyes, a residual echo of the possession, or perhaps a final reminder of the entity's last violent struggle to stay tethered to him. The house made a soft popping sound above him, the wood settling, but even that quiet noise made him flinch, as though expecting the rafters to creak into speech again. But instead there was only silence. A heavy, exhausted silence. A silence that felt like the house had finally fallen asleep. He forced himself to stand, gripping the edge of the mantel until his balance returned, and staggered toward the hallway where the faintest glimmer of moonlight cast a narrow stripe across the floorboards. His body felt bruised in places he didn't understand, along his ribs, at the base of his skull, deep in the tendons of his wrists as though invisible fingers had coiled tightly around them for hours. But he was moving again, his own limbs, his own breath, his own heartbeat thudding center true beneath his ribs. He clung to that, even as dread coiled low in his stomach. He had to check on Sarah. He crept up the stairs, each step slow and shaky, his hand trailing the banister as he ascended. The scent of cedar faded gradually with each step, replaced by the clean, cool smell of the upper hallway where the windows had been left slightly ajar. He paused outside the guest room, fearing what he might find. He remembered the way his fingers had hovered over her sleeping form, how close he had come to horror he couldn't bear to name. He nudged the door open gently. Sarah lay exactly as he had left her, curled on her side beneath the quilt, her breathing steady and soft, her hair spread across the pillow in a dark curtain. Relief flooded him so fast and so sharply he had to grip the doorway to steady himself. He watched her for a long moment, confirming each rise and fall of her chest, until the last shards of panic loosened their hold on his lungs. He didn't wake her. He didn't trust his voice yet. Instead he backed away slowly, closing the door with a tenderness he hadn't shown anything in days. He returned downstairs, each step quieter than the last. The fire had burned low, embers glowing faintly within the grate. The kuksa was unrecognizable now, nothing but a cluster of darkened, warped fragments fused together by heat. He knelt beside the fireplace again, staring at the charred remains, waiting for some sign of movement, some spark of unnatural resistance. But the fragments sat still in the coals, as lifeless as they should have been from the beginning. Still, something in the house did not feel finished. His gaze drifted slowly toward the ceiling where the attic door waited in the hall above. He felt the cool draft of air descending from that direction, carrying with it the faintest whisper of cedar, thinner now, almost pitiful, like the last breath of a fading dream. He swallowed and rose from the floor. If the kuksa had been the vessel, the cedar chest had been the cradle. He needed to be sure. Needed to know nothing remained. He climbed the attic stairs again, though every instinct in him recoiled at the thought. At the top, he paused, steadying his breath, and pushed the door open. The attic greeted him with its familiar cold, a deeper cold than any Vermont night could justify, a cold that clung to the rafters like frost. The cedar chest sat in its exact place beneath the sloping beams, the canvas sheet half folded beside it, as though someone had pulled it back earlier with quiet reverence. He stepped closer, each footfall muffled by the thick dust blanketing the floor. The chest's lid was closed, but the wood looked different now, slightly darker, as if moisture had seeped into it, warping it inward. He crouched beside it, glancing at the lock. It hung open. He raised the lid slowly, bracing himself for a rush of cold, for movement, for the lingering presence of whatever had puppeteered his limbs. But inside lay nothing. Nothing but a thin trace of ash at the bottom, pale gray, almost weightless, as though the cedar chest had exhaled it. The linen that once sat beneath the kuksa had disintegrated into fine threads, as though rotted by time in mere hours. Elias exhaled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It was over. It had to be. He shut the lid gently, almost respectfully, and descended the stairs once more, exhaustion rolling over him in heavy waves. He fell asleep on the couch in front of the dying fire, the faint crackling blending with the quiet sighs of the cooling house. When morning came, dawn spilled through the windows in pale gold, warming the wooden floors. Sarah sat at the kitchen table, sipping coffee from one of the old ceramic mugs. She smiled when he entered, though her eyes searched his face with concern. "You look like hell," she murmured. He released a dry laugh. "Feel like it too." But he felt clarity, real clarity, beneath the weariness. His body was his again. His house was just a house. His breath was whole. The scent of cedar lingered only faintly, fading like memory. Sarah reached out and touched his hand, her brow creasing. "What happened last night?" He debated for a moment. Then he told her, not everything, not the whispered word claiming him as property, not the paralysis, not the trembling silhouettes of unseen hands, but the parts he could bear to speak aloud. The strange movements. The possession. The burning. The scream. She listened quietly, her grip tightening around his fingers. "That cup should have stayed buried," she whispered. He nodded. They spent the rest of the day cleaning the house, opening every window, letting sunlight reach the darkest corners. By evening, the cedar scent had faded to something faint and harmless. The house felt brighter, almost weightless, as though relieved of a burden it had carried for years. Elias cooked dinner. Sarah laughed. They talked about painting the bedroom walls, about new curtains, about life beyond this strange chapter. And for a while, everything felt normal. Natural. Safe. Until night came. Until the fire burned low. Until Elias set his empty mug on the table. And the wood beneath it shifted. Softly. Quietly. Like something rooting itself deeper. Elias froze, breath caught in his throat, eyes slowly lowering to where the mug had been placed. The grain of the table's cedar pattern pulsed, just once, like something breathing beneath the varnish. A faint, familiar scent curled upward. Sweet. Warm. Possessive. Sarah didn't notice. She was humming softly at the stove. But Elias did, and he knew, with a cold heaviness settling behind his heart, that destruction wasn't the end. Objects don't love. But something in this house did. And it had not finished unmaking the life it wanted for itself. Elias told himself he was imagining it, that the slight twitch of the table's cedar grain was caused by the heat of the mug or by his own frayed nerves, but the moment he lifted the mug away and saw the faint rain of moisture slowly spreading outward against the wood in a perfect circle, like something breathing from beneath the surface, the cold, familiar dread crept up his spine with the same steady inevitability of a vine curling up the trunk of a tree. He touched the table hesitantly, pressing 2 fingers to the ring, and felt warmth. Not the warmth of recently placed coffee. Not residual heat from ceramic. This warmth pulsed faintly, rhythmically, as though synced to something deeper, something alive. He pulled his hand back quickly, wiping his fingers on his jeans, but the sensation clung to him, tingling beneath the skin like a fine dust he couldn't brush away. His heart quickened. The kitchen around him blurred slightly, the hum of the refrigerator fading behind the roar of blood in his ears. Sarah was still humming at the stove, oblivious, stirring a pan of butter and garlic that filled the room with comforting, domestic smells. The contrast made the dread sharper. The normalcy made it cruel. He didn't want to frighten her, not again, not after the way she had looked at him last night, a blend of worry and fear she tried to hide behind an affectionate smile, so he lowered his hand slowly to the mug, lifted it again, set it down a few inches to the left. The table shifted. Just a whisper of movement, a murmur through the wood, but enough. Enough that Elias felt that same presence, thin, yearning, possessive, pressed low in his chest, like a sigh exhaled just beneath his ribs. Something in the house was awake again. Not fully. Not with the same focus the kuksa had given it. But awake. He cleared his throat softly. "Sarah." She turned, smiling, wooden spoon in hand. He opened his mouth to speak, but the moment he inhaled to form the words, the cedar scent gathered around him again, faint but purposeful, like a hand closing over his tongue. His throat tightened. The familiar warning pricked at the back of his spine, do not speak against it. His jaw locked subtly. Sarah didn't notice. She turned back to the stove, humming again, the faint glow of the overhead lights softening around her. Elias lowered himself into the chair, trying to breathe past the heavy quiet that settled across his shoulders like a damp shawl. He told himself the sensation would fade. That the thing had burned, screamed, died. That the table shifting was nothing more than the echo of trauma, the residue of fear. But as he stared at the faint ripples circling where the mug had sat, he felt the truth settle heavily into him. You don't unmake something like that. You only displace it. The kuksa had been a vessel. The cedar chest had been a cradle. The house had been its home. But the thing itself, whatever memory or longing or hunger it embodied, had seeped deeper than wood, deeper than beams and rafters. It had seeped into him. He picked up his fork but found his fingers trembling. He reached for the napkin, but his hand paused halfway, fingers twitching before obeying him. His skin prickled. The twitch was too familiar. Too exact. The same stuttering jerk his hand had made the night he stood over Sarah's sleeping form, fingers tightening around nothing as an invisible will had tested his obedience. A cold sweat broke across his forehead. Elias? Sarah asked suddenly, turning back toward him, concern pushing through her voice. You okay? You're pale. He forced a smile, but it felt glued to his teeth, the muscles around his mouth tight and stiff. Just tired, he said, though the words caught in his throat, strained, as though spoken through splinters lodged in his windpipe. She stepped closer, reaching to touch his shoulder. And that was when the house exhaled. Soft. Sweet. Certain. The cedar scent rose like incense. The floorboards beneath his chair shifted with a gentle creak, the kind a sleeper makes when stretching beneath blankets. The mug on the table slid an inch toward him, nudged by nothing visible. Sarah froze mid-step. Did the table just? Elias swallowed. His hands were trembling now, uncontrollably, small spasms flaring intermittently as the presence inside him stirred with quiet displeasure, like a jealous animal sensing another drawing too close. He tried to control the tremor, but his fingers twitched violently, scraping against the table edge. Sarah's eyes widened, fear flickering in them. She opened her mouth to speak. But she didn't get the chance. A whisper brushed Elias's ear. Not outside. Not behind him. Inside him. Mine. The word vibrated through his bones, sending a thin filament of cold slicing down his spine. His hand jerked toward Sarah in a grotesque echo of the movement he had fought in the guest room. She stumbled backward, alarm overtaking her expression. Elias, she whispered, voice trembling, what's happening? He tried to respond. Tried to force his lips to form any word, her name, a warning, a plea to run, but his throat constricted again as the presence pressed tighter against his lungs, tightening its grip like roots twisting around a tree trunk. His vision blurred at the edges. The spoon Sarah held clattered to the floor, the metallic clang echoing through the kitchen like a bell rung inside a tomb. And then Elias did something he did not expect, something the presence did not expect. He ran. Not toward Sarah. Not toward safety. Up the stairs. Toward the attic. He didn't plan it, his body simply tore itself from the kitchen, scrambling up the steps with a frantic, uncoordinated desperation. Behind him, Sarah cried out his name, her footsteps pounding after him. But Elias wasn't running from her. He was running toward the source. Toward the cedar chest. The presence swelled inside him in a sudden, vicious surge, furious, betrayed, thrashing against his nerves as if trying to tear itself free. He staggered at the top step, gripping the wall hard enough that his nails scraped the paint. His vision doubled. His breath stuttered. But he forced himself forward, shoving open the attic door with a heaving gasp. The cedar chest sat where it always had. Waiting, the smell of old wood and ashes billowed out in a soft, warm wave, wrapping around him like a lover's arms. His stomach lurched. His muscles tightened. His right hand lifted involuntarily, reaching toward the lid, fingers curling like a child reaching for the hand that raised it. The presence inside him surged, pulling him downward. But Elias had one final spark left. Not defiance. Not hatred. Grief. He remembered himself, his uncle's house, his own loneliness, Sarah's face in the morning light, and for one thin moment, it was enough. He seized the lid of the chest with both hands and flipped it open. Light spilled out. Not bright light. Not holy light. A faint reddish glow, embers. The same ash he had seen earlier. But now it pulsed. Alive. Breathing. The presence inside him lunged toward it, like a starving thing leaping finally toward home, but Elias pulled back, wrenching his own body away as though dragging a trapped animal by its leash. His hands shook violently. His knees nearly buckled, but he kept hold of himself. He whispered one word, hoarse, raw, barely audible. Enough. The presence shrieked inside him, not through the air, but through his bones, a silent, piercing wail that made his veins feel like they were filled with ice water. He stumbled backward as something invisible tore through his chest, ripping out of him in a violent burst that stole his breath and dropped him to his knees. For a moment he felt weightless, empty in a way that hurt more than possession had. Behind him, Sarah burst into the attic, breathless, terrified. Elias. He looked up at her, throat burning, tears tracing clean lines down his ash-dusted cheeks. "I'm okay," he whispered. A lie, but the only one he could manage. Sarah helped him downstairs, one trembling arm around his waist. The house felt lighter now. Hollow. Quiet. Too quiet. They packed that night. Left before dawn. Elias didn't argue. Sarah didn't ask him to. They drove away as the first pale ribbon of morning light slipped across the fields. Elias didn't look back. Not when they reached the road. Not when the house disappeared behind the pines. Not when the air finally began to smell like frost instead of cedar. But later. Days later. Alone in Sarah's apartment when she stepped into the shower. Elias heard a soft, distant sound from inside his duffel bag. A gentle creak. Wood shifting. Breathing. He froze. Slowly, he unzipped the bag. Inside, beneath folded clothes, lay a piece of something small. A splinter. Burned at the edges. Warm to the touch. A faint, sweet scent rose from it. Cedar. Possessive. Patient. And from somewhere deep inside the grain of that tiny scrap of wood, a whisper brushed his ear, the same whisper that had claimed him once, soft as breath over skin. Mine. Elias dropped the duffel bag. But the smell did not fade. The warmth clung to his palm. And he understood, with a hollow certainty that sank through him like a stone into deep water, that he had never destroyed the thing in the house. He had freed it, and now it traveled with him. The archivist's test. Down in the subterranean wing of the university's rare books and archives, Dr. Helen Vance always felt as though she had stepped out of the modern world and into a sealed chamber of time, a place that existed at a quieter frequency than the campus above, where the hum of fluorescent lights and the ever-present hiss of climate control formed a kind of artificial heartbeat for the vault of ancient paper. She preferred it down here, preferred the sterility, the cold, the hours that stretched unbroken, because in the controlled silence of the archives, it never felt like she was competing with anyone but herself. Her ambition thrived in isolation. Tonight was no different. At 11:47 p.m., the rest of the library had long since closed, leaving her alone beneath the earth with nothing but the soft ticking of the humidity gauge, the faint metallic scent of the mobile shelving tracks, and the crisp shifting of old pages as she worked through the cryptic manuscript labeled only as Volume X. The vellum felt cool beneath her gloved fingertips, smooth in places, cracked in others, always threatening to crumble under pressure. She handled it with the reverence of a surgeon handling fragile bone. Her lamp cast a narrow pool of warm light across the table, leaving the aisles around her in soft shadow. The archives were never dark, exactly, but the peripheral dimness carried a strange weight, like a breath held by the building itself. Helen had grown used to ignoring that sensation, just the low ceilings and cement walls playing tricks, she told herself, but tonight the chill felt sharper, more deliberate. A draft brushed the back of her neck, lifting the short hairs along her skin despite the fact that the climate system was running smoothly. She glanced up, expecting to see someone near the end of the stacks, some belated graduate student searching for a reference book they should have retrieved hours ago. But the aisle was empty. Utterly still. Only the faint hum of the AC coils answered her. She returned to the manuscript, though her eyes tracked the shadows between the shelves more often than usual. The manuscript had no official catalog number, no provenance record, no acquisition log, just a brief note in the archive database claiming it had been found, in a misfiled box, origin unknown. That alone intrigued her. The university prided itself on immaculate archival records. Something this old, this intricate, simply appearing without explanation felt impossibly exciting. A find like this could secure a promotion, maybe tenure, maybe even the monograph she had been longing to publish. The prospect warmed her more than the stale coffee cooling beside her elbow. She leaned closer to the text, tracing its odd script, not quite medieval Latin, not quite Greek, not quite any conventional academic category. A hybrid language, maybe. Or a cipher. Or nonsense masquerading as depth. She pushed her glasses up the bridge of her nose and read under her breath. The sound of her own voice was a small comfort, enough to mask the faint rustle she kept hearing from the aisles, like paper being shuffled. At first she assumed it was the overhead vents stirring loose sheets on some nearby cart. But when she finally stood to stretch and walk to the end of the row, she saw no carts out of place. No loose pages. No interns' projects abandoned mid-shift. Just the shelves. And the cold. A sharper draft swept down the aisle, rippling the hem of her sweater. She turned, scanning the length of the corridor again, irritation prickling at her focus. "Hello?" she called softly, half out of courtesy, half out of mounting unease. Her voice floated forward, absorbed into the endless rows of bindings and archival boxes. No answer. She didn't expect one. Not at this hour. She started back toward her table, but something made her pause, a faint, unmistakable shuffling sound, like fingers brushing over parchment. She whipped around. Again, nothing. She exhaled sharply through her nose and forced herself to return to her work. Stress, she told herself. Or the building settling. Or the conditioning system adjusting. But when she lowered herself into her chair, her pulse was quicker. Her shoulders tight. She pulled the manuscript closer, as though proximity to its mystery might steady her. The next page was thinner, more translucent, the script denser than on the previous ones. She admired the calligraphy, precise, deliberate strokes, each character laid with disciplined elegance. She traced a line with her eyes. Then stopped. Something glinted faintly between the pages. She leaned in. A slip of paper protruded from the outer edge, tucked neatly into the crease as though used as a bookmark. But she hadn't put it there. And she had turned this page before. Slowly, carefully, she teased the thin slip free. It was vellum too, ragged at the edges, stained with something darker than age. On it was a single line of handwritten Latin, elegant and looping in a style from centuries earlier. Helen's breath held in her throat. The ink looked fresh. As if written today. She read the line aloud, her voice barely above a whisper, "Cas enas condita est pergamina altera bibliothecae regni septentrionalis." What year was the second parchment library of the Northern Kingdom founded? Her eyebrows knit. It wasn't a quote. Not a line of text with scholarly value. It was a question. A specific historical question, one she recognized instantly, because she had written an entire dissertation chapter about the Northern Kingdom's parchment trade routes and competing academic centers. But the phrasing was old-fashioned. Precise. Exact. And she had never seen this vellum before. She stared at it, heart thudding against her ribs. "Who put this here?" she whispered, as if the shelves themselves might answer. A soft clicking sound echoed from somewhere between the stacks. Slow. Rhythmic. Like someone tapping brittle fingernails against wood. Helen jolted, the slip of vellum nearly falling from her fingers. The clicking continued for several seconds, moving, shifting, with the unmistakable cadence of footsteps. Dry footsteps. She stood fast, chairs scraping against the floor with a sharp squeal that seemed offensively loud in the archive's hush. "Is someone back there?" she called again, her voice tight. No answer. Only the faint warble of cold air pushing through vents. She turned back to the manuscript, and froze. There, on the open page, in the margin near the inserted question, was a mark that hadn't been there moments before. A faint imprint. Pale. Powdery. With edges that flaked slightly. A handprint. Small. Desiccated. As if pressed by someone whose skin had long since dried to parchment itself. Helen's hands trembled around the vellum slip. Her mouth went dry. The air felt heavier. The shadows between the stacks seemed thicker, deeper, more present, as though they were watching her reaction with patient interest. She swallowed hard, her breath fogging faintly despite the chill being nowhere near freezing. "No," she whispered. "No, that's impossible." But impossibility didn't erase the handprint. And the handprint didn't erase the feeling that something in the archives was waiting. Watching. Studying her as carefully as she studied the manuscript. She stepped away from the table, unable to bring herself to turn her back on the aisles. Every instinct told her to leave. To go upstairs. To close the project and return in daylight. But when she backed toward the elevator, she realized something chilling. The overhead lights seemed dimmer than before, and the hallway leading to the exit looked longer, narrower, as though the building had stretched while she read. She forced a ragged breath. Overwork, she told herself. Lack of sleep. An overactive academic imagination. She set the vellum slip down carefully. But as she did, another shuffling sound drifted from the stacks, closer this time. Closer than any sound should be when she was alone. She turned slowly. A cold draft brushed her cheek. Page edges fluttered somewhere deep in the darkness. She didn't see anything. But she felt something. Something old. Something patient. Something that had been waiting down here far longer than she had been alive. And it had questions. Helen tried to convince herself that she wasn't trapped, that staying meant she was simply finishing a night of work in an over-air-conditioned archive with an overtaxed imagination, but the air in the subterranean wing had shifted into something thicker than cold, something that clung to her clothes and nested beneath her skin. She backed toward the central reading table, her breath shallow, the overhead lights flickering softly as if reacting to her pulse. She forced her gaze onto the manuscript again, onto the place where the faint, powder-dry handprint stained the margin. The print seemed even clearer now, edges sharper, each tiny groove more defined, as though the page had absorbed the weight of the touch and preserved it. The slit of vellum on which the Latin question was written trembled faintly in the draft, though there was no open vent near her. She reached for it with trembling fingers. Her mind scraped quickly through rational possibilities. Perhaps an intern had been working in this manuscript before her. Perhaps someone with a warped sense of humor had staged this to rattle her. Perhaps the humidity had done something strange to the ink. But each explanation dissolved as soon as she saw the handwriting again, so elegant and antiquated that even her trained eye recognized the style as pre-17th century. And yet, impossibly, the ink shimmered with freshness. No bleed, no fading. Newly written. Recently touched. Her chest tightened. She lifted the vellum to the light, and the shadows around her seemed to gather in closer, as if the room itself leaned toward her hands. The question, written in a scholar's hand, was insultingly specific, a foundational year in the Northern Kingdom's parchment archives, a detail rarely taught, one usually known only to specialists in her exact subfield. She swallowed. Someone, something, was asking her the kind of questions students were grilled on in doctoral exams. A test. Her pulse quickened. She whispered the answer aloud, as if the room expected her to respond. 983. The second archive was founded in 983. Her voice sounded tiny, swallowed by the cement walls. The AC hummed. Something rustled in the next aisle. A shelving cart squeaked, slowly, softly, its metal wheels turning without a hand to push them. No, she breathed, stepping back. Enough, I'm leaving. She turned toward the exit hallway, but the moment she took 3 steps, the sound of pages shuffling rose behind her, loud this time, frantic, like someone flipping rapidly through a book with dried fingers. She spun around. Her reading lamp flickered once. And the manuscript was open to a different page. She was certain, absolutely certain, that she had not touched it since stepping away. But now volume X lay wide, its pages flattened at the binding as though something heavy had pressed down on them. A different line of text stared up at her, written in the same elegant, archaic hand as the question. Rect. Said non-dum de cinemas. Correct. But we do not stop. A cold sharpness stabbed through her lungs. Before she could move, before she could even blink, something else happened, something small, subtle, horrifying in its simplicity. A second handprint appeared. Right beside the first. Not appearing with sudden drama, not fading into view like a cinematic effect, but forming, the vellum indenting ever so slightly, the dust and residue shifting in the shape of long, skeletal fingers pressing down from nowhere. Helen felt the pressure in the air, felt the weight of that contact even though she could not see the hand itself. Her knees nearly buckled. No, she whispered again, her voice cracking. No, this is stress. Overwork. A trick of the air. A soft tapping interrupted her. From behind her. In the aisle she had just walked through. Tap. Applause. Tap. A long, slow drag of something brittle across the metal shelving. She did not turn around. Her eyes burned as she fought the urge. Instead, she backed toward the exit again, her shoes squeaking faintly against the polished floor. Her breath was too loud in her ears, matching the hum of the overhead lights. As she reached the main corridor, she put her hand on the door handle, intending to flee upstairs and laugh the whole thing off as a stress dream. The door didn't move. Helen froze. She pulled harder. Nothing. The magnetic lock shouldn't have been active at night. She had accessed this door hundreds of times. Her ID badge was clipped to her sweater. She tapped it against the sensor. The scanner blinked red. Not green. Not yellow. Red. No, she whispered. Not possible. She tapped again. Red. Again. Red. Her badge worked when she came down. The system had no reason to be locked. Her breath quickened into panic. She forced herself to turn, pressing her back against the cold metal door. The archive stretched before her, rows upon rows of shelving units, the overhead lights buzzing softly, the faint chill of the AC brushing the small hairs on her arms. Nothing moved. Nothing seemed out of place. But something was watching from between the stacks. She felt it. The silence pressed in around her, heavy, expectant. She took a shaky step forward. The PA system crackled. Helen jerked, heart slamming against her ribs. The speakers in the archive ceiling hadn't functioned properly in years. They certainly weren't supposed to be active at night. Another crackle. Then a faint hiss. Then a voice. Dry. Formal. Perfectly articulate Latin filtered through static. Propositum primum. First question. Helen's throat tightened as if invisible fingers pressed lightly around it. The voice continued. Si pergamina caret atrimento, quid esset memoria? If parchment lacked ink, what would memory be? She shook her head violently. Stop. This is ridiculous. Who is doing this? Who's in here? A long, brittle silence hummed through the speakers. Then, respond, discipula. Answer, student. Something scraped behind the stacks. Slow. Approaching. Helen's palms were sweating despite the icy temperature. She closed her eyes briefly, trying to center herself, trying to call on logic, on training, on anything grounded. The question was philosophical, metaphoric, almost childish. A test question from centuries ago. Her voice came out thin, trembling. Oral tradition. Memory would depend on the living. Ink preserves it, but without ink, memory becomes oral, fluid, shifting. The PA clicked softly. The static pulsed, like breathing. Rect. Correct. Helen pressed the back of her head against the door, exhaling shakily. Then the voice added, almost gently. Sed iterum. But again. The lights overhead dimmed. The temperature dropped fast enough that the glass on the humidity gauge fogged in seconds. Helen's breath turned visible. A faint whisper threaded itself through the aisles, like someone dragging 1,000 pages across a stone floor. New text appeared on the manuscript behind her. Not written. Formed. Shimmering faintly on the vellum. Latin again. Another question. A deeper one. An impossible one. One so specific to Helen's own specialty that no prankster, no student, no colleague could have guessed it. She felt something move at the end of the aisle, not loud, not dramatic, just a small shift of shadow, as if someone had taken one soft, brittle step closer. A step she didn't want to see. Couldn't bear to see. Her pulse hammered. Because she realized something with hollow certainty. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't her imagination. This wasn't stress. She was being examined. By someone who had died down here, and the test was only beginning. Helen's first instinct was to run, but the rows of shelves ahead of her looked impossibly long, stretching into a shadowed depth that seemed to bend and narrow as though the archives themselves had reshaped to ensure she would not find an exit. The air had grown frigid enough that her breath came out in short, pale streams, and the overhead lights flickered so weakly that every flash felt like a frame cut from a film reel, brief moments of visibility between longer spans of gloom. The PA system crackled again, the dry voice seeping through the speakers like a slow leak of dust and decay, and she felt a prickling at the back of her neck as the words crawled through the cold air. Propositum secundum. Second question. A new line of text shimmered faintly on the open manuscript behind her. She didn't want to turn around, didn't want to put her back to the shelves where she knew something moved with the same brittle grace as parchment, but the voice seemed to coil around her, nudging her toward the table as though she were nothing more than a student called to recite. She forced herself to turn. The vellum glowed faintly under the flickering lamp, and the new question had been carved into the margin, not written in ink, but etched directly into the surface of the page, thin strokes gouged into the animal skin as if made by a quill sharpened to a needle's point. Quas fut primus scriptor cum eminit regnum septentrionale extinctum? Who was the first writer to record the fall of the Northern Kingdom? Her heart sank. Not because she didn't know, but because the question was impossibly, painfully tailored to her. She had spent 15 years studying the Northern Kingdom archives, tracing obscure fragments of their downfall, reconstructing the chronology from the scraps left behind. And there was only one correct answer, only one scholar whose account predated the others. But her mouth felt locked. Her jaw tightened. A cold numbness spread from her teeth down her throat, as though the act of speaking had been seized by some unseen examiner who demanded not only correctness but reverence. Her voice finally scraped out, hoarse and thin, Saran of Velholm. He wrote the first record. 1042, the archive fell utterly still. The overhead fan stuttered. The lights buzzed. And then the PA crackled softly. Rect. Correct. She sagged against the table in relief, though it felt hollow, temporary. The relief of someone who briefly outruns a predator only to hear it loping behind them again moments later. She glanced toward the exit corridor, hoping, praying, that the door light had turned green. It hadn't. It sat dark, a dead, red gleam reflecting off the metal like an unblinking eye. Another shuffle of movement passed between the nearest shelves, and she caught the faint silhouette of something leaning forward, something long-limbed, stooped, and impossibly thin, as if the man had been dried out like paper and folded into the stacks. She turned away, refusing to meet the shape's gaze, refusing to acknowledge the soft sound of parchment fingers brushing against book spines. The PA crackled again, this time the voice fractured slightly, like brittle bone under pressure. Said non-licit buyer. But you may not leave. A new question formed. Not etched. Not inked. But rising on the vellum like a bruise blooming beneath the skin. Helen felt her stomach twist. She didn't even need to read it yet. The terror came first, like a cold wind through stone corridors. She forced herself closer. Her lamp flickered violently, almost going out entirely. In that moment of dimness, she swore she saw another pale handprint materialize on the page, this one even more skeletal, the fingertips elongated, the palm cracked like dry leather. The question beneath it unfurled slowly. Cur regnum cessidit. Why did the kingdom fall? Her pulse stopped. This was a trick. Not a factual question. A philosophical one, and the single most debated point of Helen's entire field. There was no right answer. Not one the living agreed on. But the dead often believed they held the only truth. No, she whispered, her voice shaking violently, that's not fair. There is no consensus. There's no single cause. Something moved in the aisle behind her. A soft scraping sound. Then a dry rustle, like a body shifting after centuries of stillness. The PA hissed so sharply the speakers rattled. Cur. Regnum. Cessidit. Why did the kingdom fall? Not a request. A demand. The temperature dropped again, sharply enough that her fingers numbed around the manuscript's edges. Her breath turned white, drifting in a cloud toward the shadowed shelves. Something exhaled back, cold, stale air brushing against her cheek like the kiss of a century-old draft. Helen swallowed, her throat dry. She tried to analyze, to think like an academic, objectively, critically, but every answer she rehearsed in her mind felt wrong. Felt insufficient. Felt dangerous. Her field was full of theories, political fragmentation, religious schism, famine, plague, internal theft of archives, the so-called scholars' rebellion. Her breath caught. Her mind seized on a chilling thought. What if the examiner wanted his version, the version he believed when he died? She forced her voice out in a trembling whisper, the fall wasn't political. It wasn't military. It was epistemic. She swallowed. Hard. The scholars hoarded knowledge. Restricted it. The kingdom collapsed because its truths were locked away. Everything unraveled from secrecy. The PA went silent. A long, horrible silence. Then. Wrecked. Helen nearly collapsed with relief. Her knees trembled violently. Her breath shook out of her in uneven bursts. She clutched the edge of the table for support, her fingers slipping on the cold metal. But the PA crackled again before she could even stand fully straight. And the voice whispered, softer now, more intimate, with a dryness that seemed to scrape directly against the inside of her skull. Ultima. Final. The lights dimmed to almost nothing. The shelves creaked. Something stepped closer. So close she felt the air shift beside her ear. The final question scrawled itself across the vellum in jagged, desperate lines. Caspergo custodiat memoriam, who then will guard the memory? Helen froze. Her heart lurched violently. Her throat constricted. Because she knew what the question meant. She understood the implication beneath it. Her mind raced in panic. The kingdom had fallen because knowledge was hoarded. Because archives were sealed. Because the scholars became jealous guardians of truth. Because some scholar, had bound himself to the archives in death, trying to preserve what the living had failed to guard. And now he wanted a successor. Her mind screamed at her. Don't answer. Don't speak. Don't accept the premise. But the voice breathed against the PA, a long exhale like dry parchment crumbling. Respond. Discipula. Answer, student. The room closed in. Something shifted behind her. A shadow lunged. Helen shut her eyes and whispered, barely audible. The living must guard it. The PA hissed violently. The shadows halted mid-movement. The air shuddered. Then, after a long, trembling pause. Transisti. You have passed. A soft sigh slipped through the aisles. Not hers. A sigh of something ancient settling, releasing, letting go. The lights flickered once, bright, clean, almost warm. And the door behind her unlocked with a loud click. Helen gasped as if surfacing from drowning. But the PA clicked on one last time, the voice so faint it sounded like the brittle crackle of a page turning to ash. Nunc quies. Now rest. The archive fell still. And Volume X, the manuscript she had nearly died for, was gone from the table. Only a dark scorch mark remained. Helen stumbled through the newly unlocked archive doors with the instinctive urgency of a drowning person crawling onto shore, but the moment the steel frame sealed behind her with a soft pneumatic sigh, the relief she expected did not come. Instead, the hallway outside felt strangely too bright, too empty, too hollow, as though the world above had been subtly thinned while she was trapped below. Her ears rang with the ghost of the PA system's final directive, Nunc quies, the syllables lingering in her mind like fine dust clinging to the folds of an old robe. She leaned against the beige wall, struggling to catch her breath, but each inhale felt too shallow, too cold, as if the archive had left its air inside her lungs, replacing something warmer she could no longer name. The fluorescent lights of the staff hallway flickered in a way they never had before, slower, more deliberate, like blinking eyes, and the steady hum of the HVAC system now carried an undertone she wished she hadn't noticed, a faint, rhythmic cadence that matched the breathing pattern of the archive 2 floors below. She pushed herself away from the wall, legs shaking, and began the long walk toward the building's front entrance. A deep, unnatural stillness pressed against her as she moved, no distant chatter from night shift custodians, no rattle of carts being pushed down linoleum, no keyboard clicks from the reference desks. The library was open 24 hours, but it felt abandoned, museum dry, like she had stepped into a preserved diorama of a university rather than the university itself. Her footsteps echoed too loudly, as though the floors were amplifying her presence to someone, or something, still listening. As she passed the main stairwell, motion sensor lights snapped on above her, but instead of their usual warm glow, the bulbs buzzed with a brittle, crackling tone that immediately set her nerves on edge. She forced herself to ignore it, stepping faster, but a whisper of cold air brushed along her collarbone as she reached the first-floor lobby, and the automatic doors at the far end of the building did not open. They simply reflected her, a pale, shaking figure with dust smeared along her sweater and streaks of cold perspiration drying along her neck. She approached the door slowly, lifting her library badge with a trembling hand. The sensor light flashed green, but the doors remained still. She pressed her palm to the glass. It was warm. Too warm. As though someone had stood there moments before, breathing steadily against the panel. She pressed harder, ignoring the sweat building on her brow, and after a long moment, far longer than any automatic system should take, the doors slid open with a reluctant shudder, like someone pulling apart glued pages. She stepped outside into the chilled New England night and breathed deeply, trying to shake the lingering dread clinging to her ribs. The quad was silent except for the distant hum of sodium vapor lamps and the rustle of early autumn leaves scraping across the pavement in slow spirals. She expected the cool air to clear her head, but instead it sharpened everything, the faint tremor in her hands, the echo of the Latin questions still threading themselves through her memory, the horrible certainty that she had been watched so intently that the feeling remained even now, like eyes had followed her through the doors. She turned to look back at the library, hoping the normalcy of its colonial facade would comfort her. But the windows were dark. All of them. Even the ones that should have been lit. The rare books wing was 2 floors underground. She knew no light should come from there. But the ground-level offices, the reading rooms, she had walked past them minutes ago. They had been lit. She remembered it, she was sure. Now they were black squares set into brick, like open mouths. Helen swallowed hard, wrapped her arms around herself, and hurried across the quiet quad. She didn't feel safe until she reached her car, and even then, her hands shook so violently as she fumbled with her keys that she dropped them twice onto the asphalt. She drove home in near silence, headlights cutting through a thin mist forming along the road. The radio flickered between stations without her touching it, and each time it caught onto a clear frequency, there was nothing, no music, no talk shows, just static threaded with a faint, dry whisper. She turned it off. All the way off. But the whispering continued for 3 more seconds. At home, she turned on every light, kicking off her shoes with unsteady movements as she crossed her living room and set her bag down. Her apartment normally smelled faintly of citrus from the cleaner she used obsessively. Tonight it smelled faintly of vellum. Old vellum, dry and pale and flaking at the touch. She pressed a shaking hand to her face and laughed, high, breathless, terrified, because the scent was impossible. It had to be psychological. Leftover panic. She made herself a strong cup of tea, hoping the warmth would chase off the chill still clinging to her skin. But when she lifted the mug to her lips, a brief, metallic tapping echoed through her apartment. Tap. Pause. Tap. Pause. Like the sound of a metal shelving track being nudged with a brittle fingertip. Helen froze. Her skin prickled. She glanced toward her hallway, heart pounding so hard she felt it echo behind her eyes. The tapping came again. Tap. The sound was closer. Stop it, she whispered, though her voice shook. You're not here. You can't be here. But the tapping grew louder. More insistent. The hallway light flickered once, twice. Then went out completely. Helen stood perfectly still, mug trembling in her hands. The apartment fell silent, and for a heartbeat she dared to hope it was over. Then, faintly, from the darkness of her hallway, the dry, brittle whisper of a page turning. Helen dropped the mug. It shattered across her kitchen tile. No, she breathed, backing away, clutching the edge of the counter. No, I passed. I answered you. I passed. A soft exhale answered her. Not human. Not breathy. A sound like dust being blown from the spine of a book. Her hallway lights flickered back on. For a moment, she saw nothing. Then her eyes landed on the floor. A thin trail of gray dust led from her front door to her bedroom. As if something had walked through the archive's remains. And followed her home. Helen pressed a hand to her mouth, biting back a hysterical choke. She moved toward her bedroom with the slow inevitability of someone descending into a grave they already knew was theirs, each step echoing too loudly across the hardwood floor. The dust trail stopped at the foot of her bed. Something rested on her quilt. A book. No. Not a book. A manuscript. Volume X. The one that had vanished. The one that had burned, but the cover was pristine now, the vellum smooth, the binding tight. As though it had been restored. Perfected. Waiting. Helen approached slowly, her throat constricting. Her fingers hovered above the cover. The manuscript opened. On its own. Pages riffling in a rapid blur until they stopped on a single sheet. Blank. Then, slowly. Painfully slowly. Letters burned themselves onto the vellum in dark strokes, as if written by an invisible quill pressed with furious precision. Caesiarit Proximus Archivarius. Who will be the next archivist? Helen's heart stopped. A soft, dry handprint appeared beneath the words. Then another. Smaller. Then a third. Perfectly shaped to match her own. She stumbled backward, knocking into her dresser as panic overwhelmed her. The lights flickered violently. The air in her room turned cold enough that frost spread across her windowpane in thin branching lines. A shadow moved beside her closet door, not lunging this time, not attacking, simply watching. Waiting, she clutched her chest, tears blurring her vision. No, she whispered. No. You said I passed. You said. A voice whispered directly into her ear. Not over a speaker. Not from the hallway. But from inches away. Transisti, Virgo Custodias. You passed, therefore you will guard. Helen screamed. But the shadow surged forward, darkness folding around her like a closing book. And the last thought in her mind before everything went black was that maybe the Northern Kingdom never fell at all. Maybe its scholars simply became part of the shelves. When Helen woke, she expected the familiar disorientation of night terror, the sudden jolt into consciousness, the frantic heartbeat, the desperate need to convince herself that whatever she had dreamed had been nothing more than a tangle of overworked neurons, but instead she surfaced slowly, like a diver rising through cold, still water, aware first of the weight in her limbs, then of the faint chill spreading from the floor through the thin carpet, and finally of the quiet, rhythmic hum surrounding her, a vibration she felt in her jaw before she fully registered it in her ears, the same low monotone she had listened to for years in the rare books archive, the same pitch as the climate-controlled compressors that kept manuscripts alive long after their authors had turned to dust. Her eyelids fluttered open, and she realized with a hollow stillness that she was no longer in her apartment. The ceiling above her was too low, painted in the muted institutional white she had stared at countless times during overnight shifts. The air smelled faintly of vellicore, dried glue, and old vellum. The cold she felt beneath her was not hardwood but sealed concrete, and somewhere behind the walls, fans whispered with perfect, machine-regulated breath. She was in the archive. Again. But as she sat up, slowly, stiffly, she knew it wasn't the same archive she had worked in before. The lighting was different, dimmer, more golden than fluorescent, a soft amber glow illuminating the edges of the mobile shelves that towered around her like silent sentinels. The aisles were deeper, stretching into a vanishing point she couldn't place, and as she pressed her hand to the floor to steady herself, her fingers brushed a thin dusting of powder, old paper, scraped from centuries of decay, sprinkled like ash around where she had been lying. She pushed herself upright, her breath unsteady, heart heavy in her chest as the events of the previous night bled back into her mind, the test, the questions, the shadow at her closet door, the voice whispering, Transisti, Virgo Custodias. You passed, therefore, you will guard. Her pulse stuttered. She rose to her feet, legs trembling, and took a step forward, her shoes scraping softly against the concrete. The air shifted as she moved, as though acknowledging her presence, a subtle exhale of cool air drifting down the long central aisle. Something rustled deeper in the stacks, not threatening, not stalking, but deliberate, like a page turning itself over. Helen swallowed, forcing herself forward until she reached the nearest shelf. The call number label was blank. No numbering. No classification. Just an empty strip of yellowed paper, curling at the edges. She moved to the next shelf. Blank. And the next. Blank again. It was impossible. These shelves had never been unmarked in her years working here, but as she walked further, the realization settled over her like a slowly dropping shroud. These shelves weren't meant for circulation. They weren't part of the library she knew. They were part of something older, deeper. Something curated by hands no longer flesh. She kept walking until she reached a reading table set in the center of a circular clearing. A single lamp glowed upon it. A single chair awaited. And upon the table rested a manuscript, unbound, fragile, the pages stacked neatly with a bone folder placed beside them. Her breath hitched. It was Volume X, restored to its original form as though the fire had never touched it, the vellum smooth and pale under the lamplight. But as she approached, her chest tightened with a terrible, instinctual knowing, this was not her copy. Not the version she had studied. This one was incomplete. Waiting to be filled. Helen reached out with a shaking hand, and the moment her fingers brushed the first page, the lamplight flickered, not extinguishing, not dimming, but shifting, as if something unseen had passed behind her, pausing briefly to observe. She forced herself to open the manuscript. The first page was blank. The second page held the faint impression of handwriting, like a palimpsest gently urging itself into form. The third page held her name. Helena Vancia. Written in the same elegant, archaic Latin script she had seen during the examination. Her blood went cold. She flipped to the next page, unable to stop herself. Another name followed, faded almost to nothing, but still legible, Marcus Veldrin, a scholar from the early 1700s. She knew the name. He had vanished during his thesis work. She turned another page. Agnes Revere. Another missing historian from 1891. Another. L. Whitcomb. 1932, and another. And another. The pages formed a ledger, a quiet, terrible list of scholars lost to time, lost to the archive. The last entry was hers. Beneath it, the page waited, empty. For her own recording. For the next archivist after her. She staggered back from the table, her pulse slamming against her ribs as panic surged in her chest. No, she whispered, shaking her head. No, I passed. You said I passed. Her voice cracked. You said I could rest. A low, brittle whisper drifted from the shelves behind her. Not words. Just a sound, the rasp of a long dry hand sliding gently along wood. Helen turned slowly. At the far end of the aisle, a figure stood, thin as a shadow, draped in library dust, posture bent as though centuries of work had folded him into the shape of a question mark. His eyes were hollow, not empty, hollow, carved out by hunger for unfinished knowledge. The long-dead scholar. The jealous archivist who had tested her. He stepped forward, the motion slow and careful, like a curator approaching a fragile exhibit. Helen backed away until her hands hit the edge of the reading table. The figure stopped 3 shelves away, head tipping slightly in an eerie gesture of respect, or possession, before lifting a desiccated hand and pointing to the open manuscript awaiting her. Her voice trembled. I don't belong here. A brittle whisper answered, skating across the air like parchment dragged over stone, Memoria custodita, non fugit. Memory that is kept, does not run. The shadows around the shelves lengthened. The air grew colder. The figure took one more step toward her. Helen looked back at the manuscript, her name inked into its ledger. She understood then, with a quietness that almost felt like surrender, that the archive had not chosen her because she failed. It had chosen her because she passed, because she knew the kingdom's truths too well. Because she could guard them. Because, like the scholars before her, she would not leave the work unfinished. And as she sat slowly, almost calmly, into the chair before the manuscript, the archive's hum softened into something like approval. Acceptance. Continuation. She picked up the bone folder with a steadying breath. The figure in the stacks retreated one step, its hollow eyes fixed on her with a scholar's solemn acknowledgement. Helen touched the page. And began copying. Her handwriting formed clean, precise lines across the vellum as the lamplight warmed around her, sealing her into the endless quiet where knowledge was guarded, where memory was preserved, where the living could vanish without ever dying. Somewhere above, the world turned on without her. Students laughed. Professors lectured. Clocks ticked. The library's surface-level lights blinked awake at dawn. But in the depths beneath it, in the archive that kept what history forgot, Dr. Helen Vance took her place at the long table, the steady hum surrounding her like a heartbeat, the pages whispering softly around her, and the centuries-old scholar fading into the aisles as if welcoming a colleague home. She copied her first line. And then her second. And then her third. The archive exhaled, satisfied. Another guardian appointed. Another memory secured. And above the page she worked on, just faintly, just beginning to form, another line of text shimmered into existence. Cause erit proximus? Who will be next? As the light flickered gently overhead, Helen's whisper filled the cavernous, dust-filled quiet, soft, resigned, steady. Rest, she murmured. The archive is never empty. And deep in the stacks, a page turned itself over. The 404 route. Owen Holberg had been driving for 12 hours straight, long enough for the sunsets at his back to smear into one continuous ribbon of fading amber on the rearview mirror, long enough for the vents to start blowing air that smelled faintly of his own exhaustion, long enough for the white dashed lines on the asphalt to blur into something hypnotic and unreal, and as he nudged the wheel with 2 fingers, half-hearted, half asleep, he reminded himself for the 15th time that he should have pulled into a rest stop hours ago, but the deadline gnawed at him with a low, insistent pressure he'd carried for years, the freight delivery that meant a month of mortgage payments, his sister's medical bill, the promise he'd made to himself not to fail anyone again. The sky ahead was bruising from dusk into early night, a strange smear of purples that looked more like a watercolor than weather, and the CB radio hissed with intermittent bursts of static, no voices, no chatter, just the thin whine of empty frequencies bouncing between transmission towers. He tapped the side of the device absently, as though he might knock a signal loose, then glanced at his GPS, the cracked screen glowing a faint, sickly blue, its map freezing for a moment before flickering into a route adjustment that made no sense. Recalculating, the text blinked for several seconds, then reloaded with a new line highlighted in red, a narrow path veering sharply off the interstate. Route 404, it read. 32 minutes saved. Recommended. Owen frowned, rubbing the heel of his palm against his eye. That's not a road, he muttered. He'd run this cross-country path for almost 15 years. He knew every rest stop, every fuel station, every trick the GPS tried to pull when it lost signal, but he didn't know Route 404. The number sat oddly in his mind, like something half-remembered, like a typo, like a glitch. The GPS pinged again impatiently, arrow blinking, urging him off the interstate. He checked the overhead signage. No exit listed as 404. No towns that matched the map. And yet, the off-ramp appeared ahead in the gloom, a narrow slip of asphalt peeling away from the highway like a scar, unlit, unmarked, lined with pale grass waving in the rising wind. Owen gripped the wheel tighter. His deadline pulsed behind his ribs like a sore tooth. Saving half an hour meant delivering on time. Delivering on time meant not getting fired again. The guilt of too many past mistakes pushed at him like a hand between his shoulder blades. He signaled, almost on autopilot, easing the truck into the lonely ramp, the tires humming in protest as they transitioned from familiar pavement to the rougher, older asphalt. The interstate vanished behind him in the mirror. Ahead stretched Route 404, a long, narrow road cutting through miles of dark woodland, the trees on either side crowding inward like towering silhouettes, their branches forming latticed shadows that crawled across his windshield as he drove. The sky deepened to indigo. The air changed too, cooler, heavier, carrying the faint smell of damp earth and pine sap, the scent clawing its way into the cabin even with the vents turned low. Owen flicked on his brights, illuminating the narrow road ahead, but the beams seemed to dissolve into the dark, swallowed rather than reflected. He clenched his jaw. It's just a back road, he said into the silence, though the cabin swallowed his voice, and the CB radio hissed in response, as if disagreeing. The road wound sharply left. Then sharply right. Then stretched on in a straight line so dark it seemed he was driving directly into an empty horizon. And then, just ahead, he saw her. A lone figure standing on the gravel shoulder, facing his truck. A woman. He blinked, leaned forward slightly, trying to understand what he was seeing. She wore a long, old-fashioned dress, the fabric pale and fluttering around her ankles in the rising wind, and her hair was pinned in an old-time style, waves held back with combs that glinted in the headlights. She didn't look lost or frightened. She looked expectant. As if she had been waiting. She raised a hand, a slow, graceful wave, and smiled. Owen's skin prickled. A cold unease crept up the back of his neck. He passed her slowly, his hands tightening on the wheel, heart giving a small, startled kick. She didn't move, didn't step back from the verge, didn't flinch at the roar of his engine. She simply watched him pass, waving as though greeting an old friend. When the truck finally rolled beyond her, Owen exhaled a shaky breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding, his pulse thudding in his ears. He checked the mirror. She was still there. But the headlights no longer caught her face. Only her silhouette. Standing alone. Unmoving. The forest swallowed the road behind him. Owen tried to shake it off. People walked back roads. Hitchhikers, weird locals, maybe a broken-down car she'd left behind. She wasn't his problem. He focused back on the road. Back on the deadline. Back on the nagging ache behind his sternum that whispered that he was running out of chances. 10 minutes passed. Then 20. The road stretched endlessly forward. No intersections. No signs. No houses. No vehicles. The GPS froze again, flickered, then continued along Route 404 as though everything were perfectly normal. But nothing about this felt normal. The sky had gone from indigo to a flat pitch black, the kind of absolute darkness that made the road seem to float beneath the truck like a strip of fabric unspooling into a void. Owen fiddled with the radio, seeking human voices, music, anything, but the airwaves all spat static threaded with faint, low murmurs that sent goosebumps across his arms. He turned it off. Another hour crawled by. Then another. And somewhere in that thick, oppressive darkness, Owen realized he had seen the same dead oak tree twice, the one with the split trunk and the hollow at its base. The same patch of gravel. The same curve in the road. His stomach dropped. "No," he whispered. "No, I didn't turn around." He checked the compass on the dashboard. It spun once, twice, then settled on a direction that made no sense, northeast, though the road had been taking him southwest, or so he thought. His hands began to sweat against the steering wheel. The cabin felt tighter, smaller. The smell of damp earth crept thicker into the air, heavy, metallic, like soil freshly turned after rain. And then, up ahead, he saw her again. Standing in the center of the road. Not on the side this time. Not waving in greeting. Standing directly in his lane, illuminated fully in the high beams, her old-fashioned dress fluttering as though underwater, the oil lamp in her hand glowing with a warm, amber flame that somehow reflected in her eyes even from 30 yards away. Owen's breath hitched. She didn't step aside. She didn't move at all. He slammed on the brakes, tires screaming against asphalt, the truck shuddering violently as the cargo rattled in its restraints. The world lurched forward, then snapped still. The woman didn't flinch. Didn't blink. Didn't show a single sign of fear. She simply tilted her head. Smiled again. And lifted the lamp higher. Owen's pulse roared in his ears. His voice cracked out of his throat in a dry whisper. What do you want?" The woman stepped toward the cab with an impossible smoothness, as though her feet barely touched the ground. The flame of the oil lamp didn't flicker. Didn't move. Didn't cast shadows. As she approached, the smell of damp earth surged into the cabin, thick, cloying, like wet grave's oil and rusted iron. Owen gagged and covered his mouth with the back of his hand. She reached the driver's side door. She paused. Then she smiled wider. And slowly, like someone remembering the steps of a familiar dance, she lifted her free hand and placed it on the handle of his door. The truck engine sputtered. The lights dimmed. The radio crackled to life with a burst of static. And Route 404, silent, empty, endless, held its breath. The woman's hand wrapped around the handle of Owen's truck door with a disturbing softness, her fingers pale and thin, almost translucent in the glare of the high beams, as if her skin remembered light rather than reflected it, as if she had only recently returned to the living world and wasn't fully settled within it. Owen's breath snagged in his throat as he leaned back instinctively, the seatbelt biting into his chest, his pulse hammering so hard he felt it echo in his teeth. The metal beneath her fingers creaked slightly, not the normal click of a handle being tested, but a slow, reluctant groan, like something old remembering how to move. For a single suspended moment, the entire night felt poised on the edge of her next gesture. Yet she didn't pull the door open. Instead, she leaned close, the oil lamp held aloft, and the flame cast a warm, impossible glow over her face. She had the features of an old photograph, soft edges, delicate lines, a beauty that belonged to another era, but her eyes were wrong. They were far too dark to be marooned in a face that calm. Dark like cellar dirt. Dark like the underside of old roots. Dark like the hours Owen spent avoiding his own memories. She tilted her head, studying him with a polite, eerie patience, and when she finally spoke, her voice slid into the cab through the air vents, bypassing the glass, a hollow murmur that seemed to vibrate inside his skull rather than outside it. "You missed your turn," she whispered. Owen swallowed, his tongue dry, forcing out a hoarse whisper. "Lady, I don't know who you are, but you can't just walk up on a truck in the middle of the highway. Do you need help?" She blinked slowly, the way someone might blink after being told a joke they didn't understand. "Help?" she repeated, as if tasting the word. "No. I am here for the detour." A cold shiver rippled beneath his skin. He reached for the gear shift, intent on putting the truck in reverse, but the moment his fingers brushed the knob, the engine died. The dashboard went black. The headlights cut. The heater choked out one last breath of warm air, leaving him in a dead, suffocating dark so total that for a second he could not distinguish the interior of the cab from the world outside. Somewhere in the blackness, he heard the delicate tap of her knuckles against the window. Once. Twice. A third time, softer. The kind of knocking that suggested she already knew he would eventually open the door. Owen grabbed the flashlight from the cup holder and flicked it on with shaking hands. The narrow beam cut through the darkness, landing squarely on her face where she still stood inches from the glass. She didn't flinch. Didn't react at all. But the oil lamp she carried flared brighter, its flame rising unnaturally tall, giving off no heat, only the smell of damp soil, old rust, and something faintly metallic beneath it that made his stomach twist. "Go away," he said, louder now, pushing fear into anger to keep his voice steady. "Just leave me alone." Her smile widened by a fraction, barely perceptible, but sharp enough to push a new wave of dread through his chest. "You've already passed me twice tonight," she said softly. "And the road only loops for those who refuse to listen." His grip tightened around the flashlight. What do you mean, passed you twice?" Another blink. Another tilt of the head. She looked almost sympathetic. Almost. "Route 404 is not a highway, Owen Hallberg. It is an arrival." His heart slammed painfully against his ribcage, panic clawing at his throat. "How do you know my name?" The answer drifted into the cab on the same stale current of air that carried her scent. "I knew it the moment your destination bent toward mine." Owen reached for the door lock, desperate now, intending to shove it down manually, anything to seal himself inside, but his fingers froze midway. Because the door was already unlocked. When had that happened? His mind raced, replaying the last 30 seconds. Had she unlocked it? Had he? Had the truck? No, it didn't matter. He lunged forward to throw his weight onto the lock, but the moment his palm touched the metal, the door swung inward on its own, opening with a dull, yawning groan. Cold night air flooded the cab. The woman stepped up into the truck with the smooth, sure-footed grace of someone climbing stairs in a house she had lived in for years. She settled into the passenger seat without waiting for permission, placing the oil lamp carefully between them. Its flame brightened again, illuminating the cabin with a golden, sepia glow that turned every shadow into something elongated, stretched thin and trembling. Owen pressed himself against the driver's side door, breath heaving, and fumbled for the glove compartment where he kept his pocketknife. His fingers brushed it, almost closed around it. But her hand moved first. Gently. Slowly. A pale, cool hand placed itself on the glove compartment door, shutting it with a soft, decisive click. "No weapons," she whispered. "This is not a robbery." "Then what do you want?" he hissed, voice cracking. She lifted the lamp, and its flame trembled, not from wind, but from something like anticipation. To deliver what must be heard. Owen shook his head violently. "Look, if you're crazy or lost or whatever, just say so. I can take you to a rest stop, I can call someone." "But you can't, you're late," she said, cutting him off. The words hit him with unexpected force. Late. His sister's voice echoed faintly in his mind, "Please don't be late, Owie. Just this once." His stomach twisted. Late for what? She stared at him for a long, unnervingly still moment. Then she spoke, calmly, almost kindly. "The moment you chose years ago. The moment all roads have been leading you back toward." Owen's skin crawled. His pulse thundered. "Lady, I don't know who you think I am, but I never chose this." Her eyes glinted, reflecting the lamp flame. "You did. You chose it when you ran the red light at 217 in Lincoln Falls. When your brakes were failing. When you told yourself you had enough time." Owen froze. The world narrowed into a pinpoint. "No," he whispered. "No, how do you know about that?" She continued as if reciting from a ledger. "The boy on the bicycle survived. But he did not forget. Not the headlights. Not your name. Not the promise of justice deferred." Owen's voice collapsed into a hoarse rasp. "I wasn't speeding. I wasn't, you weren't willing to stop," she finished softly. "Not then. Not now." The oil lamp flickered, casting shadows across her face that made her look almost skeletal, as though her skin were stretched over something older, something that had been waiting to speak for a long time. "The error was not the route," she whispered. "It was the destination you chose long ago." The words settled over him like cold mud. The cab felt smaller, tighter, the darkness outside pressing harder against the windows. Owen reached for the ignition, twisting the key desperately. Nothing. The engine didn't cough. Didn't sputter. Didn't even click. It was dead. The CB radio burst into static, shrieking for a single, violent second before cutting out entirely. The woman placed her hand on his wrist. Her touch was cold enough to feel like damp soil. "It is time." Owen jerked his hand away, panic overtaking every thought, and slammed the truck into neutral, intending to roll it backward down the road. But the vehicle didn't move. Not an inch. As though something unseen had anchored it to the asphalt. The woman closed her eyes. The lamp flame dimmed. And from the far distance down the narrow black road, far too close to be natural, two blinding headlights snapped into existence. Racing toward them. Fast, wrong lane. Wrong direction. Wrong everything. Owen's breath caught. His scream tangled in his throat. The woman opened her eyes and turned to him with a quiet finality. "Your arrival is here." The headlights grew enormous. The road vibrated. Metal screamed. And Route 404, silent, dark, endless, finally delivered him to the place it had been leading all along. For a long, suffocating moment after the oncoming headlights appeared on the horizon, The cab seemed suspended between breaths, the world outside collapsing into a tunnel of light and sound that didn't yet exist but was already promised in the woman's expression, a calm certainty that settled over her face like the final stroke of ink on a page already written. Owen grasped the wheel with both hands, knuckles white, body trembling as adrenaline surged through him so powerfully he could barely feel his fingers, and in the amber glow of her oil lamp he realized with a strange, detached clarity that she wasn't looking at the approaching truck at all. She was looking at him, as though what mattered was not the collision itself, but his reaction to it. The lamp's flame stretched upward in a thin, wavering line, casting long, trembling shadows across the cabin walls, and when the woman finally spoke, her voice drifted not from her lips but from somewhere deeper, somewhere embedded into the bones of the night. "Listen," she whispered, and the sound of the words seemed to fold the darkness inward, stealing the roar of the engine, the hiss of his breath, even the distant thunder of tires rushing toward them. "Your memory is a road too, Owen Holberg. And you have been driving toward this moment since you first learned to run." He tried to speak, tried to shout at her, to demand answers, anything, but his mouth felt locked, jaw stiffening like frost creeping along metal. All he managed was a strangled gasp as she lifted the lamp slightly, its muted glow illuminating her features with a terrible softness, like the gentle expression of a teacher telling a student they had, at last, reached the question with only one answer. "You have forgotten the crossroads," she murmured, "the place where choice became consequence." Owen shook his head wildly, throat burning. "I didn't choose this," he managed, barely audible. "I never chose." But she raised her free hand to silence him, a gesture almost tender. "You chose when you did not stop." The lamp flickered. And suddenly he wasn't in the truck anymore. Or rather, he was, but he could see through the windshield into another night entirely, a memory dragged up from the depths with brutal clarity, the intersection at Lincoln Falls, the failing brakes, the way the red light blurred when he blinked sweat from his eyes, the sound of the boy's bicycle tires skidding on pavement. He hadn't hit him. The kid survived. He told himself that for years. Told himself it was luck. Told himself it was skill. Told himself it didn't matter because no one had died. But the woman's voice slid through the vision like a knife. "You told yourself you stopped in time," she whispered. "But time is not the only measure of impact." Owen's stomach lurched. The truck interior reeled back into place, but now he saw faint streaks of dirt on the passenger seat, dark, wet earth that hadn't been there before, smearing into the worn upholstery like fingerprints dragged straight out of a grave. He turned toward her, but she was no longer simply sitting in the seat. She was filling it. Or rather, the darkness around her seemed to fill it for her, pressing at the edges of her figure, making her look both solid and insubstantial, like a reflection on a window pane overlaying something far older behind it. "I am not here to punish you," she said quietly. "Only to tell you the truth." Owen's voice cracked. "What truth?" She leaned closer, and the smell of damp earth grew so thick it nearly choked him. Her lips were inches from his ear. The boy was not the one who carried the weight of that night. Owen froze. "What?" "He grew up," she whispered. "Got married. Tended gardens. Held his children in the morning light." Her voice softened even further. "But your hands never stopped shaking on a steering wheel after that night. Your sister never let you pick her up from school again. Every deadline, every mile you chased afterward was not for money or pride, but penance." Owen felt his heartbeat stagger, the truth slamming into him with the same inevitability as the headlights bearing down on them. "You have lived inside that moment," she said, waiting for a second chance to be early instead of late. The lamp flame guttered, shrinking to a trembling blue point. "Route 404 isn't a road, Owen Holberg. It is the moment you could never leave behind." The approaching headlights flared brighter, swallowing the horizon. The sound of the other truck grew into a low, thunderous roar. Owen jerked the steering wheel desperately, muscles screaming, but the wheel wouldn't move. It felt fused to the column, welded in place by some unseen force. "Please," he choked. "Please, don't let this happen." For the first time, her expression shifted. Not cruelly. not triumphantly, but with an unfathomable sadness, as though she were grieving something on his behalf. "I cannot change the road you already chose," she murmured. "I can only deliver the map." Owen slammed his fist against the ignition, against the dash, against anything that might spark life back into the engine, but the deepest dread uncoiled in his stomach as he realized the truck wasn't off. It was waiting. The same way the woman was waiting. The same way the road had been waiting. "Tell me what to do," he shouted, voice breaking. "Tell me how to survive this." The woman turned her face toward him fully. In the sputtering lamp glow, her eyes no longer looked dark, they looked ancient, like the hollows of a long-buried saint carved into stone. "All arrivals must be met," she whispered. "Even yours." And then, her voice dropped into something lower than human. "Brace." Owen barely had time to inhale before the headlights hit the cab with a blinding white force, a wall of illumination so intense it erased the silhouette of the woman entirely, swallowing her, swallowing the interior of the truck, swallowing everything. For a split second he felt suspended, weightless, caught between two instants in time. And in that frozen breath, the woman's final words curled through his mind like a last, whispered verdict: the error was written long before the destination. Then the world detonated into screaming metal and impossible light. The moment the light swallowed the cab, the world seemed to tear open along some invisible seam, and Owen felt himself pitched forward into a collision that refused to happen all at once, stretching itself into an impossible, agonizing continuity, as though Route 404 had decided he would experience every millisecond of the impact as distinctly as beads on a prayer string sliding between trembling fingers. The oncoming headlights ballooned, expanding into a blinding, soundless sun that seemed to peel the darkness off the road, and for one strange, suspended second he saw his own reflection in the windshield, not his present face, but versions of it blurred together, younger, older, exhausted, terrified, determined, guilty, hopeful, all the selves he had driven with across decades, now superimposed into an expression of raw, bone-deep regret. Then the noise hit. Metal shrieked with a pitch so sharp it cut through the marrow of his spine, the kind of sound no natural machine could make, a grinding, twisting howl like the ribcage of the truck itself was being wrenched inside out. The steering column snapped violently sideways, crushing his knuckles against the dash, and air that smelled of hot rubber and exploding coolant blasted into the cabin as the world folded around him. His skull slammed against the headrest, his chest seized, and he felt the seatbelt lock with a brutal, unforgiving jolt that carved a line of fire across his torso. But even as glass shattered in crystalline bursts, tumbling inward like fragments of frozen rain, the strangest part was that Owen's mind remained lucid, horrifically lucid, as though the collision were not happening to his body but through him, as though Route 404 had trapped him in the thin membrane between impact and outcome. He saw, in the periphery of the blinding white, the woman with the oil lamp, or what had been the woman, her outline breaking apart into thin sheets of dust, drifting through the cabin as though she were made of the same soil that had clung to her voice. Her lamp tumbled upward instead of downward, flame elongating in slow motion, stretching into a wavering flame pillar that seemed to reach beyond the windshield into the night sky, as if lighting some invisible passage that only the dead could see. Beside it, Owen glimpsed the silhouette of the other truck, a massive shape barreling forward with impossible speed, yet when it struck, he did not feel the blunt, crushing force he expected. Instead, he felt something constrict around his ribs, around his lungs, around the back of his skull, a tightening like hands made of cold wind gripping him from every direction, pulling, guiding, separating. It dawned on him then, slowly, dreadfully, that the collision was not a single event. It was a doorway. And he was being pulled through it. His vision broke apart into shards, the glowing dashboard lights flickering between red and dead black, the cracked windshield distorting into ripples as though underwater, the world beyond dissolving into streaks of white that bled into the horizon. His thoughts grew viscous, stretching into slow, thick streams. His ears rang with a deep, continuous tone that wasn't quite noise but a resonance, like the hum of a giant tuning fork pressed against the roadway, vibrating with grim inevitability. Through the ringing, through the collapse of sound and form, a voice threaded itself into the moment. Her voice. But it wasn't the same hollow whisper he had heard before, This voice was layered, multiplied, echoing as though she were speaking from the center of a vast, empty tunnel carved beneath the earth. "Arrivals must be met," she murmured. "Even when they are late." Owen tried to speak, to beg, to scream, but his mouth filled with the thick, copper taste of fear, and all he managed was a broken exhale that dissolved instantly into the sound of the collision stretching itself out like an unending ribbon. The light around him dimmed, just slightly, and in that dimming, he saw something that froze his blood even as metal twisted around him like molten taffy. He saw the boy. The one from years ago. Standing on the deserted roadside of Route 404, watching the truck implode with that same quiet expression he'd worn when he'd pulled himself bleeding from his bicycle, stunned but alive. Except now the boy looked older, or younger. Or both. As though Route 404 gave shape not to a person but to a memory wearing a human face. Owen reached for him, a reflexive, desperate motion carved from guilt rather than reason, but his arms did not move. Instead, the world outside dropped away entirely, replaced by a swirling darkness filled with faint silhouettes, tires, guardrails, trees, floating like debris in a slow black river. The headlights of the oncoming truck dissolved into a single point of white. Time buckled. Sound bent. And Owen felt something inside him begin to separate, the part of him anchored to the physical world peeling away from the part that had been waiting on this road, circling toward it since the night he ran the red light. The voice came again, closer now, inside him, around him, above him, impossible to locate. "You cannot flee arrival," she whispered, "when you have been driving toward it for so long." The light swallowed his vision again. The grinding metal softened into a low rumble. The world shuddered, once, as though all of existence had taken a single, terrible breath, then fell abruptly silent. Owen closed his eyes. Or perhaps his eyes were already closed. The road beneath him disappeared. The wheel left his hand. The seatbelt slackened. And in the last infinitesimal sliver of awareness before everything went dark, he felt the unmistakable sensation of a hand brushing his shoulder. Gentle. Inevitable. Guiding him forward into the place Route 404 had been leading all along. For a long time, minutes or hours or something far longer than either, Owen floated in a darkness so total, so depthless, it felt less like the absence of light and more like the presence of something ancient, a vast, unmoving expanse pressing against him with the weightless certainty of a sealed vault. There was no pain. No sound. No metal shrieking. No headlights blooming into catastrophe. Just a humming, low and steady, like a truck engine idling far below an ocean, a vibration that seemed to pass through his bones rather than around them, a reminder of the world he had come from but no longer occupied. When sensation finally returned, it did so reluctantly, like a reluctant dawn pushing its way through fog, a faint pressure beneath his back, the cool brush of air along his cheek, the distant scent of pine needles mixed with damp earth. Owen's mind clawed its way toward clarity, grasping at familiar thoughts like handholds, the deadline, the brake failure, the woman with the lamp, the headlights, but they all wavered in front of him like reflections on rippled water, present but unreachable. He forced his eyes open. Above him stretched a sky the color of bruised slate, an early evening hue that felt neither like night nor day, as if the sun had stalled somewhere out of sight, unwilling to complete its descent. Owen sat up slowly. He was sitting on asphalt. Cold. Smooth. Illuminated by a faint sheen of moisture as though a recent rain had passed without leaving clouds behind. Ahead of him, Route 404 stretched endlessly in both directions, a straight, narrow line flanked by dense, unmoving trees whose branches formed an arch overhead. No wind stirred their leaves. No insects murmured. No engines passed. The world held its breath, watching him. He touched his forehead, expecting blood, expecting broken glass, expecting the hot sting of a wound, but his fingers came away clean. There was no pain. No ache. No soreness. He felt weightless. Unanchored. "Hello?" he called, though his voice felt strange, hollowed out, as if the night were absorbing it before it could travel. "Is anyone a soft glow answered him. Not from the sky. Not from headlights. From behind him. Owen turned. 20 paces away stood the woman with the oil lamp. Except she no longer seemed like a woman. Not entirely. Her form was intact, same dress, same calm expression, same hair pinned with old-fashioned combs, but the flame of her lamp burned too bright now, its glow reaching farther than any living fire could, illuminating the edges of the trees with long, trembling shadows. She regarded him with the same gentle patience she had shown before, the expression of someone who had waited a very long time for someone to wake. "You brought me here," Owen said, voice low, hoarse. "Didn't you?" She lifted the lamp slightly. Its glow flared once, acknowledging. "You chose the road," she answered, her voice soft as wind through a graveyard gate. "I only kept you on it." Owen stared at her, trying to summon anger, rage, anything, but all that rose was confusion, and aching bewilderment spreading in his chest. "Am I dead?" She tilted her head. "You have arrived." The words landed like a stone dropped through water, sending ripples down the length of Route 404. Owen rose unsteadily to his feet. His legs felt normal. His breathing felt normal. But something beneath that normalcy was wrong, terribly wrong, like he was standing inside a reflection of the world rather than the world itself. "I didn't hit the truck," he whispered, trying to piece the memory together. "I didn't feel anything at the end." She nodded slightly, as though this were the detail he should start with. "Impact is not the only way to cross," she murmured. "Some arrive by contact. Some by choice. Some by long, long detour." He closed his eyes. "So this is it," he said. "This is where the road ends." "For some," she answered. "Not for you." He opened his eyes, frowning. "What does that mean?" The lamp flame tightened into a narrow, flickering thread. "Look." She raised her free hand and pointed past him. Owen turned. Behind him, parked perfectly in the road, sat his truck. Or something wearing the shape of it. The cabin was pristine, no shattered glass, no dents, no crushed metal, yet the windows reflected nothing. Not the trees, not the road, not the sky. And not him. Owen stepped toward it on trembling legs. The air around the truck shimmered faintly, as though heat lifted off asphalt at midday, and a low hum vibrated beneath his feet, the steady thrum of an engine running, even though the headlights were dark. He reached the driver's side mirror. The reflection showed only the road. Only the empty forest. Only the vanishing horizon. Not him. Not even a shadow. His breath hitched. "Why?" he whispered. "Why am I not there?" "Because you are no longer part of the world that casts reflections," the woman said behind him. "You have crossed into the place between." Owen turned back toward her, throat tight. "Between what?" She stepped closer, lamp raised. For the first time, he noticed the earth clinging to the hem of her dress, the dark, heavy soil of a newly turned grave. "Between where you were," she whispered, "and where you must go." The lamp flame stretched, reaching out toward him, and in its glow he saw something move at the edge of the forest, a cluster of dim forms, shadowed, waiting just beyond the reach of the light. Some tall, some small, some bent and tired looking. The silhouettes of travelers. Of arrivals. Of the ones who had come before. And then, far behind them, he saw another glow. Headlights. Weak, distant. Growing. A truck approaching. Slowly. "That's," his voice broke. "That's my rig. The real one." She nodded. "Your body has not yet been found. Not yet released. You may follow it, if you wish." Hope flared, wild and desperate. "I can go back." She held up her free hand, palm facing him, a gesture gentle but firm. "Not through the living. Through memory." The lamp flame dimmed. "The body returns to the world. The soul does not always follow. Owen's knees trembled. Then what happens to me? She stepped close enough that the warmthless glow of the lamp brushed his cheek. You may stay, she said softly. Or you may walk. The road does not force you. Behind her, Route 404 stretched on forever, silent, empty, waiting. Ahead of him, the distant headlights grew brighter. A choice. A crossroads. The first he'd been given in a long time. Owen closed his eyes, steadying his breath. He thought of the boy on the bicycle. Of promises broken. Of deadlines that had never mattered. Of the years he'd spent punishing himself quietly, mile after mile. He opened his eyes. I don't want to be lost anymore. The woman nodded, lowering the lamp. Its flame steadied, soft and small. Then walk, she murmured. He stepped forward. Past her. Past the lamp. Onto the center of Route 404. The headlights ahead flared, welcoming, widening into a tunnel of pale gold. And as Owen walked toward them, one step, then another, the road beneath him softened, the darkness peeled back, and somewhere far behind, the woman's voice drifted to him like a final benediction. Arrivals are not endings, Owen Hallberg. They are where the road begins to remember you. He took one last breath of the cold, pine-scented air. Then he stepped into the light. And Route 404, quiet, endless, eternal, closed behind him like a book returning itself to the shelf. The cabin fever dollhouse. The winter storm had been raging for 3 full days when Laura Bishop first realized how unbearably silent her apartment could be, the kind of silence that didn't settle so much as it pressed in, thick and woolen, muting the edges of everything until even her own breath seemed to vanish an inch from her lips, swallowed by the stillness of the enforced lockdown that had turned the high-rise into a vertical row of hermit caves. She was used to living alone. She had chosen this solitude after the breakup, after the arguments that stretched far past midnight, after the packed boxes and slammed doors, but she hadn't been prepared for a winter this long, or for the way the wind outside scraped its nails across the window panes, rattling the old aluminum frames as if trying to pry them open. She'd taken to leaving the TV on mute just to break the vacuum, letting the soft glow of moving images keep the living room from feeling like a museum sealed after hours. But even that low comfort vanished when the power flickered mid-afternoon on the third day, and the building fell into that deep winter hush unique to storms that trap an entire city behind closed doors. When her elderly neighbor, Mrs. Harrow, knocked, and knocking itself was unusual, since the hallway was colder than the stairwell and nobody had reason to leave their units, Laura almost didn't answer, her instincts telling her to conserve warmth, conserve energy, conserve the tiny illusion that she was safe inside her sealed little world. But the knock came a second time, softer, almost apologetic, and Laura sighed, wrapped herself tighter in her blanket shawl, and cracked open the door. Mrs. Harrow stood hunched against the hallway draft, bundled in a quilted coat that looked older than the building, her gloved hands resting against a large object wrapped in linen. She smiled in that gentle, slightly too wide way that made Laura suspect she was lonelier than she ever admitted. "My dear," she said, breath clouding in the hallway air, "I thought this might brighten your week. Storms are cruelest to those living alone." Laura forced a small smile, expecting a plate of cookies, or maybe a thermos of homemade soup. Instead, Mrs. Harrow extended the linen-covered object. It was surprisingly heavy. Surprisingly solid. "It's beautiful," the old woman murmured, patting the top as Laura accepted the weight. "Handmade. And it looks just like your apartment layout. You see, a tiny world inside a world. Something to keep you company." Laura's fingers tightened around the object, its corners digging gently into her palms. "A dollhouse?" she asked, unsure how else to describe the shape beneath the linen. "More of a miniature home," Mrs. Harrow corrected softly, her eyes gleaming with something between affection and nostalgia. "A perfect little reflection. You can decorate it however you like. It helps with the long nights." Before Laura could ask anything more, why she had it, why she was giving it away, why now of all times, Mrs. Harrow squeezed her arm with a papery hand, nodded as if completing a transaction older than either of them, and shuffled back toward her apartment, closing the door with a final soft click, leaving Laura alone in the hallway with the bundled gift humming faintly with the strange warmth of another person's decision. Inside her apartment again, she set the wrapped object on the dining table, hesitating. The wind outside groaned through the building's old ventilation shafts. The lights flickered twice. The dollhouse, if that's what it was, seemed to settle, its weight pressing into the tabletop with an almost expectant gravity. She unwrapped it slowly. Linen peeled back. Dust rose in a fine, glittering sheet. And the thing beneath emerged like an artifact exhumed from a forgotten attic, a handcrafted dollhouse, beautifully detailed, its wooden facade carved to resemble the exact entryway of her own apartment, down to the placement of the peephole and the tiny, brass-knobbed door. Laura's breath stilled. She leaned closer. Through the miniature front windows, glass panes no thicker than a sliver of ice, she could see into the rooms, her living room, recreated with unsettling accuracy, her narrow galley kitchen with its mismatched tiles, her studio corner with the easel she hadn't touched in 2 weeks, even the tiny radiator under the south-facing window. Every architectural quirk had been reproduced. Every strange angle unique to this older building. The more she looked, the more eerie it became, not because it was uncanny, but because it was flawless. She couldn't stop herself from opening the tiny hinged back panel, revealing the interior fully. The craftsmanship was extraordinary, hand-painted miniature wallpaper matching her own faintly floral pattern, microscopic shelving units, blank picture frames waiting to be filled. There were tiny cardboard moving boxes in the corner of the dollhouse living room, one half closed, echoing the box she had never finished unpacking after the breakup. Whether it was coincidence or intentional, the detail tugged at her chest with a strange, softened ache. In the empty dollhouse bedroom, a small wardrobe sat open, equally empty. A perfect little void. A place where a life might restart. Laura exhaled slowly, something loosening in her ribs that she hadn't realized she'd been holding tight. Maybe Mrs. Harrow was right. Maybe she needed something to fill the long hours of lockdown. Something small. Something harmless. Something she could control, at a time when everything outside her apartment felt uncontrollable. She ran a fingertip along the dollhouse's tiny staircase banister. Smooth. Polished. Almost warm. She brought the dollhouse to the living room coffee table, positioning it directly across from the sofa so she could look at it while she rested, while she sketched, while she tried to coax inspiration back into her fingertips. The storm outside howled, rattling the windows again, but inside, the dollhouse sat quietly, patiently, like a pocket-sized echo of her world waiting to be arranged, waiting to be inhabited. She laughed softly, feeling just a little ridiculous, and set about crafting furniture out of old cardboard, modeling clay, bits of fabric she had stuffed in her sewing drawer. She made a miniature mug for the kitchen counter, a stack of books for the bedroom nightstand, a tiny palette and paintbrush for the studio corner. Hours slid by. The storm deepened. The building creaked inside. And yet the dollhouse glowed warmly under her lamp, its tiny windows reflecting amber light that made the interior look alive, lived in, safe. She didn't even realize how deeply she'd become absorbed until she looked up and saw that night had fully fallen, the windows now showing only the swirling white of wind-tossed snow. Her phone buzzed, a text from her sister asking if she was holding up. Laura typed back a quick reply, then returned her gaze to the dollhouse. Something about it pulled at her thoughts, not unpleasantly, but insistently, like a quiet child tugging at a sleeve. She picked up 2 small wooden pegs, unfinished figures that had come with the dollhouse, and painted them both. One with her hair. One with his. She paused afterward, brush trembling for no reason she could name. The wind howled. The lights flickered again. She placed the tiny Laura figure in the dollhouse's living room, right on the sofa replica, and set the ex-boyfriend figure near the front door, where he had stood during their final argument months ago, her memory dredging up details she wished she'd forgotten. Something inside her tightened, regret, longing, anger, she wasn't sure, and she almost removed his figure before deciding to leave it where it was for now. The dollhouse seemed to hum faintly, like wood expanding under warmth, though the air in her apartment had grown cold enough to fog her breath. Laura wrapped herself tighter in her blanket, murmuring, "All right, little house. Keep me company tonight." She turned off the standing lamp. The dollhouse remained illuminated, not brightly, not unnaturally, just a soft glow from its windows as the storm raged outside, a tiny reflection of her own space holding steady through the night. And as she curled up on the sofa, half asleep, she could have sworn she heard something from inside the dollhouse. Not movement. Not a creak. Something lighter. Almost like a sigh of relief. By the time the storm slipped into its fifth day, the world outside Laura Bishop's apartment had become a gray, swirling void, the kind of weather that dissolved skylines, erased streets, and made even the nearby buildings vanish behind curtains of snow so thick they devoured depth entirely, and her apartment, usually just small and quiet, had begun to feel like a sealed terrarium, humid with her own breath and heavy with the stagnant warmth of radiator heat. She kept the dollhouse in the living room now, positioned squarely on the coffee table like a second hearth, something to glance at between sips of tea or while she flipped through sketchbooks she could no longer bring herself to draw in. It wasn't just a distraction anymore, it had become the centerpiece of her days, the tiny world she checked the way other people checked weather reports or morning news. She had grown accustomed to waking up and wandering straight to it, noticing which little details she'd left unfinished, an unpainted miniature side table, a tiny scrap of fabric she meant to stitch into a bedspread, and arranging the figures for the day, placing the Laura Peg doll on the miniature sofa or by the kitchen counter, and deciding where her ex's figure should stand. But sometime in the middle of the fifth morning, as the wind wailed down the hallway vents and a distant alarm bell from another floor echoed faintly through the pipes, Laura noticed something strange. Her figure wasn't where she'd left it. She had placed it last night in the dollhouse bedroom, tucked carefully beneath the little scrap of folded fabric she'd fashioned into a blanket. Now it sat on the living room couch instead, leaning slightly against the tiny armrest as though she positioned it there deliberately. For a moment she simply stared, eyebrows knitting, trying to reconstruct her memory of the previous night. Had she moved it? Maybe she'd changed her mind mid-setup and forgotten. Maybe she'd been tired, half asleep, her thoughts knotted from spending too many days alone. She shrugged it off gently and nudged the miniature back into the bedroom with a small, bemused laugh. "You wandered in your sleep," she murmured to the little peg shape before closing the dollhouse's back panel again. But she hadn't touched the figure of her ex-boyfriend at all last night, that one she remembered clearly. She had left it in the front hallway of the dollhouse, the tiny head tilted just slightly toward the door, creating the uncomfortable impression of him arriving or leaving. She hadn't decided which interpretation she preferred. He wasn't there either. Laura frowned and scanned the miniature apartment. No tiny figure. She leaned closer, her breath fogging faintly in the cold air. Nothing in the kitchen. Nothing on the tiny bedroom floor. Nothing in the studio corner. She reached in, shifting one of the miniature cardboard moving boxes. Just as she lifted it, something rolled from beneath it. The little peg doll version of her ex-boyfriend. Lying on its side. Face turned up as though staring at her from the floorboards. Its tiny painted expression, soft and neutral the night she created it, looked oddly strained now, the painted mouth slightly smudged, the eye dots uneven. Laura's breath hitched. She didn't remember painting it that way. She knelt closer, pushing her hair behind her ears, and examined it more carefully. The paint hadn't been smeared, it had been scratched. Tiny, thin marks ran across the peg face, as though a pin or needle had carved shallow lines over the eyes, the cheeks, the mouth. A cold tremor slid down her spine. Something in her apartment creaked, the old wooden hallway floor bowing under the shifting weight of the storm. The building breathed quietly, just the way old buildings do, but today the breath felt closer. Warmer. Watching. "It's just the heat," she whispered to herself, though the radiator valves had been rattling inconsistently for hours. She replaced both miniature figures, placing them on opposite sides of the dollhouse living room. And then the sound came. Soft. Delicate. Almost sweet. A tiny giggle. High-pitched. Childlike. And close, far too close to come from the storm-muted hallway outside. Laura froze with her hands still inside the dollhouse, her fingertips brushing the dollhouse carpet. Her breath stilled in her throat. The giggle came again, barely a second long. A little trill. A bright chirp that should have belonged to something harmless. But there was no one else here. No children in the building. No open windows. No toys. Nothing that could have made a giggle so small it sounded like it had been exhaled by something under 10 inches tall. Slowly, refusing to jerk too fast, she drew her hands out of the dollhouse and sat back on her heels. The room was still. The storm outside groaned against the window frame. Laura reached for her phone and checked the hallway camera feed. Empty. She checked the time. 2:14 p.m. She checked her heartbeat with a palm against her chest. Fast. Unsteady, but real. She turned back to the dollhouse. Nothing moved. Nothing shifted. The figures stayed exactly where she had put them. She exhaled shakily and told herself she must be hearing things, sleep-deprived, isolated, too many days without another human voice. She stood up, stretched her strained shoulders, and went to make tea. As she poured water into the kettle, she heard the faintest tap behind her. Then another. Something striking wood. Soft. Rhythmic. Like the sound of a tiny hand knocking. Laura swallowed hard, forcing herself to turn slowly, kettle still in hand. The dollhouse back panel was closed. But one of the tiny windows, just one, was no longer flush with the frame. The miniature bedroom window had opened a fraction, its tiny wooden hinge askew. She set the kettle down a bit harder than intended, the clang ringing too loudly in the quiet room. "All right," she said to the empty apartment. "Enough." She strode to the dollhouse and shut the window gently. She ran a thumb over the hinge. It was firm. Secure. Maybe she hadn't pushed it all the way closed while dusting. Maybe would warp from the heat. Maybe, a sudden metallic rasp echoed from the front door. Laura spun. The deadbolt had clicked. She hurried to it, expecting to see that a draft had nudged it, but when she twisted the lock, it resisted. Stuck. She pulled harder. Nothing. It held fast, as though someone had thrown their full weight against the other side, forcing the bolt into place. "You've got to be kidding me," she muttered, bracing her foot against the wall and yanking. The lock didn't move. The handle didn't budge. She checked the secondary chain lock. It had swung itself into the latch. Her pulse spiked. Okay. Okay. It's the cold. The metal's contracting. She tugged again. Harder. The door didn't even rattle. The apartment felt smaller suddenly, the air thicker, the quiet heavier, and Laura's eyes flicked back to the dollhouse as a faint vibration nudged the edges of her vision. Something inside had shifted. She crossed the room cautiously, every hair on her arms lifting. The dollhouse kitchen light, just a tiny LED she'd rigged from an old holiday ornament, was on. She hadn't turned it on. Her stomach tightened with a deep, primal unease. She reached toward the back panel, hesitated, then forced herself to lift it open. The two tiny figures were no longer in the living room. Her figure stood in the miniature kitchen. The ex-boyfriend Peg lay on the dollhouse bedroom floor, broken cleanly at the waist. Snapped. Splintered. Its lower half lay a few inches away as though it had been thrown. Laura's stomach dropped. She touched the broken halves with shaking fingers. The wood wasn't cracked in a natural way, it had been twisted. Something had applied pressure. Sharp pressure. The giggle came again. This time from inside the dollhouse. Laura yanked her hand away and stumbled backward, knocking over a stack of sketchbooks. Her breath poured out in panicked bursts, visible in the chilled air. "Who's there?" she said, voice unsteady. "What are you?" Silence. Only the howl of the wind. And then, softly, unmistakably, the tiny kitchen sink faucet turned on. A delicate silver thread of water trickled from the miniature tap, impossible, ridiculous, yet she watched it with her own eyes as the little droplets pooled in the sink basin. Laura backed up slowly until her shoulders hit the cold wall. Her mouth felt dry. Her skin buzzed with dread so sharp it felt electric. She tried her phone. No signal. No Wi-Fi. No bars. She moved toward the balcony, but the glass door was sealed, frozen shut from the outside, ice forming white feathers across the edges. The apartment had become a sealed box. A dollhouse of its own. And somewhere inside the miniature replica, something giggled again, a high, delighted sound, as though proud of its work. Laura's fear tightened into something sharper. Anger. She marched back to the dollhouse, slamming the back panel open again. "Stop it," she snapped, voice trembling. I said stop. For a heartbeat nothing moved, nothing breathed. And then, slowly, the tiny bedroom door inside the dollhouse creaked open. The miniature version of her apartment door. But she hadn't carved any hinges into that door, it was glued into place. The tiny door swung wider. Laura's breath stopped. A shadow stood inside. Small. Thin. Not one of the peg figures. Something with shape. Something with limbs. Something shifting slightly, as if waiting to see whether she would run or kneel. Laura backed away, steps unsteady, the blood pounding in her ears. And then the tiniest voice whispered, from inside the dollhouse, from inside the miniature bedroom, high, breathy, and disturbingly close. "Don't leave. We're not done yet." By the time dusk bled through the storm-thick clouds and settled into the cramped angles of Laura Bishop's apartment, the atmosphere had changed in a way she felt in her bones long before she dared admit it. Something subtle but definite had shifted, like a new weight in the air, a quiet insistence that the apartment no longer belonged fully to her but had begun rearranging itself around a presence with its own preferences, its own boundaries, its own possessive little heartbeat. The dollhouse sat on the coffee table exactly where she'd left it, but now it seemed to draw the lamplight toward itself, as if the room were gently bending around the miniature home, shaping itself like a bow to an instrument that expected to be played. The storm outside had worsened, dragging long howls of wind through the building's vents, the kind of deep, groaning gusts that made the old pipes moan like something waking reluctantly. Laura tried the front door again just after sunset, her sixth attempt of the afternoon, twisting the lock until her fingers ached, pulling with the full weight of her shoulder against the doorframe, even jiggling the hinges with a flathead screwdriver she found in her kitchen junk drawer, but the lock held firm, immovable, as if welded to the frame by a force that didn't rely on screws or metal but on intention. The hallway beyond the peephole was pitch dark. Earlier in the day she'd seen the soft glow of emergency lights casting faint amber stripes across the carpeting, but now the hallway looked as though the building had swallowed the light whole. She returned to the living room and stood several feet away from the dollhouse, refusing to get close, arms wrapped tightly around her ribs as she stared at the miniature bedroom door inside, the one that had opened on its own, the one she triple-checked hours earlier only to find it slightly ajar again each time she blinked away. She had shoved a toothpick through the frame to act as a wedge around noon. Now the toothpick lay neatly snapped in half beside the tiny wardrobe. "Stop touching things," she whispered under her breath, voice shaking. For a full minute, nothing responded. She dared to take one more step back, her socked foot brushing against a sketchbook she dropped earlier. Then, creak. The dollhouse living room door moved. Half an inch. Deliberate. Slow. The air in the apartment thickened so suddenly her lungs resisted as though she were inhaling humidity rather than fear, and every light dimmed at once, just a tremor, just a flicker, but enough to send her pulse surging hot in her throat. She backed against the wall. "No," she hissed, breath trembling. "Enough." She switched on the TV in desperation, raising the volume to drown out any potential whisper from the miniature rooms. Static blared. No channel. No signal. Only a thin, high-frequency frost of sound that filled the room like ice fog. Behind the static, the dollhouse released a sound of its own, a tiny clatter. Then a high, delighted giggle that crisped the air like a hairline crack spreading through glass. Laura turned off the TV, heart pounding painfully. "What do you want?" she asked, hating how her voice broke. No answer came. But the dollhouse kitchen light, the little LED she hadn't touched since that first day, blinked on with a soft pulse, the glow warm and golden and deeply wrong. Laura watched helplessly as the tiny figure she'd painted to resemble herself, her miniature double, shifted slightly where it stood beside the dollhouse sink, the head tilting, the tiny painted hairline brushing the shoulder of the fragile wooden form as though the figure were taking a curious, attentive breath. "Stay still," Laura begged. It didn't. Slowly, the mini Laura figure lifted its tiny carved arm by a quarter of an inch. Laura clamped a hand over her mouth, biting down on panic, refusing to scream. "Stop," she choked. The miniature arm lowered. A small, satisfied giggle echoed from inside the dollhouse's dark kitchen. Laura felt her knees weaken. She slumped against the wall, breath shaking, and tried to steady herself. "You're hearing things," she told herself, though the explanation felt hollow and flimsy. "You're alone too long. You're tired, you're scared, you're imagining," a loud click echoed from the hallway. The lock on her front door, still bolted, had just turned further on its own, as though someone on the other side were sealing it shut for good. Laura sprinted to the door, both hands grabbing the cold metal handle, yanking with enough force to pull muscle. The bolt didn't budge. "Let me out," she screamed, pounding on the wood. Her voice echoed emptily. The hallway offered nothing back. She sank to her knees, gripping the doorframe. Her breath fogged the air. The temperature had dropped again, sharp enough that frost was beginning to bloom on the apartment's interior windows. She rubbed her arms violently, forcing warmth into her skin. The dollhouse gave a soft, decisive thump, as though a tiny piece of furniture had fallen over, or been pushed. Laura shuddered, rose slowly, and turned. The dollhouse back panel had opened itself again. She had locked it with painter's tape an hour ago. The tape hung neatly coiled beside the house, removed and placed gently on the table. As though by careful, selective fingers. Laura approached cautiously, every step measured, like walking toward a sleeping animal that might bite. The miniature living room was in disorder. The tiny sofa was knocked over. The little cardboard books she'd made were scattered. And the tiny figure meant to resemble her ex-boyfriend, already broken into two pieces earlier, was now entirely missing. Laura's stomach twisted into a cold knot. "Where are you?" she whispered to the dollhouse. A soft scuffling sound answered. From inside the miniature bedroom. She crouched slowly, peering into the tiny room. At first she saw nothing. Then her eyes registered movement, subtle, almost imperceptible. Something in the bed. A tiny shape beneath the little fabric blanket she'd sewn. It rose slightly. Fell slightly. As if breathing. Laura sucked in a sharp breath. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no, no." She reached inside with trembling fingers and ripped the blanket away. The ex-boyfriend peg lay beneath it. Or what remained of it. It had been twisted even further, the wood fibers split and curled like torn muscle, and the painted face was now entirely scraped off, leaving a pale, featureless oval of raw wood. Something had crushed the figure's head inward, tiny, deliberate indentations marking the surface like fingerprints. Laura stumbled backward with a choked cry. Her shoulder hit the bookshelf, knocking two sketchbooks to the floor. And then she heard the unmistakable sound of her actual apartment bedroom door clicking. The hinge creaked. Slowly. Precisely. Laura turned, dread scraping up her spine. The real bedroom door stood slightly open. She had left it closed. She would have sworn on anything that she had left it closed. And from the shadowed crack came a low, strained wooden sound, like a tiny chair being dragged across a tiny floor. "Don't," she whispered to the room. "Don't. Please." She edged forward, heart hammering, every instinct screaming to flee, to hide, to curl up in a corner, but the apartment was too small, the air too thick, the locks too solid. The closer she stepped toward the bedroom, the more she felt the cold pressing outward through the door, as though the miniature world inside the dollhouse had begun bleeding into the real one, imprinting its tiny detailed geometry into her life-sized home. She reached for the door. Her fingertips trembled as they brushed the wood. She pushed gently. The door swung inward on its own. The room was empty. But the window, frosted white from the storm, now had 3 small, distinct fingerprints smudged into the ice. Too small to be hers. Too perfectly spaced to be accidental. And on her bed, lying atop the rumpled blanket, was something that made her legs nearly buckle. The tiny wardrobe from the dollhouse. Life-sized. Sitting exactly in the center of her mattress. She staggered back, gasping, clutching the doorframe. The wardrobe hadn't existed. She hadn't built one for the real apartment. But there it was. A precise enlargement of the miniature version, same wood grain, same tiny brass knobs, same dimensions multiplied perfectly to human scale. "This isn't real," she whispered. "This can't be real." A small giggle came from inside the wardrobe. Higher than a child's. Too high. Too thin. Too delighted. Laura's breath faltered. "Stop," she screamed, voice cracking from fear and fury. Silence slammed into the apartment like a curtain. For several seconds, nothing moved. Nothing breathed. She became aware of the sound of her own heartbeat, sharp, wild, animal. Then came the slow scrape of a latch sliding. The wardrobe door eased open a fraction. Just enough for a sliver of darkness to peer out. And then, from both the wardrobe and the dollhouse simultaneously, she heard it, the same tiny, eager whisper echoing in stereo from 2 different worlds. "Don't yell. I'm trying to make us a home." Laura turned and ran. She bolted for the front door, clawing at the locks, sobbing, yanking the chain so hard it cut into her wrist. The door didn't move. The apartment dimmed around her like a throat closing. Behind her, the dollhouse lights all flicked on at once. Every tiny room. Every tiny space. Illuminated with a cold, artificial glow. And from inside the dollhouse bedroom, the miniature Laura figure, her own carved likeness, turned its tiny head toward her in a series of sharp, unnatural clicks. The miniature hand lifted. Pointed at her. And the voice came again, soft, loving, possessive. "Stay. You're mine." Laura did not sleep that night, nor did she truly stay awake. Instead, she sat with her back pressed against the sealed front door, every muscle locked and rigid, trembling vigilance as the dollhouse across the room pulsed with its cold little lights, glowing like a miniature city waking for the night, its windows bright and patient and watching her with the attention of a creature that had waited a long time for someone to finally belong to it. The storm outside raged harder, the wind clawing at the concrete skin of the high-rise, howling down its vents in long, predatory sighs that felt less like weather and more like breath, but all of that noise felt distant compared to the tiny sounds inside the apartment, soft scuttling, faint tapping, the gentle creak of something wooden brushing against the floorboards. Every so often, Laura locked her jaw and whispered to herself, "Don't panic, don't panic, don't panic," but panic had already seeped into her bones, thick and numbing, and she couldn't tell anymore whether the fog of fear constricting her thoughts came from inside her mind or from the shrinking, suffocating atmosphere of the apartment itself. Her breathing fogged the cold air in front of her, the temperature having dropped so drastically that frost was climbing the corners of her walls in delicate, branching veins. Then, just as she felt her heart steady itself into a dull pounding rhythm, she heard the faintest tap, a tiny, polite knock, from somewhere much too near. She stiffened. The dollhouse bedroom window was open again. No draft had opened it, no ventilation could have. She had sealed the hinge earlier with hot glue and a strip of tape. The strip of tape now lay neatly folded beside the dollhouse, like a pressed flower. Slowly, shakily, she rose to her feet. The room spun slightly. She hadn't eaten in hours, and she caught herself against the wall, dragging in a breath that felt thick and wrong, too heavy with the dollhouse's scent, varnish, stale wood, and something sweetly metallic, like the faintest trace of old blood diluted in water. "I'm getting out," she whispered, said it aloud just to hear something human in the room. "I'm getting out even if I have to break the—" A noise cut her off. A soft, brittle snap. Like a matchstick breaking. It came from her bedroom. Laura froze. Her limbs stiffened into a single trembling line, her breath turning shallow, her skin crawling with the unmistakable sensation of being watched from behind a cracked door. She forced herself toward her bedroom, each step an effort of sheer will. She reached the doorway. The wardrobe, its impossible life-sized form, still sat on her bed like a tombstone. Its doors were slightly open. Something moved inside. Something tiny, but confident. Laura clamped a hand over her mouth and inched forward, peering through the gap. Inside the wardrobe stood the miniature version of herself. Life-sized now. Or rather, wrong-sized, as though someone had taken her real body and shrunk it without shrinking its proportions. Its wooden face had no mouth carved into it anymore. Instead its surface had smoothed over, pale and blank, like a face yet to be drawn. But the eye dots, the simple black ink circles, were still there. And as Laura watched, those dots turned upward, directly toward her. The peg Laura tilted its head in a jerky motion, the wood creaking with the strain. Laura stumbled backward with a strangled cry, slamming into the wall. The miniature figure stepped out of the wardrobe slowly, its movement stiff and puppet-like, but purposeful. As it advanced, the overhead lights flickered violently, casting the room into stuttering snapshots of motion, peg figure forward, peg figure closer, peg figure stepping with impossible precision, its tiny wooden hands twitching as though eager to touch. In the living room, the dollhouse lights flared brighter, throbbing in sync with Laura's heartbeat, and she felt, as though through a second skin, something tug at the edges of her awareness, urging her to look toward it. Against her will, she turned her head. The dollhouse back panel had opened wide. And inside the dollhouse living room stood another tiny figure she hadn't carved. It was new. It wore a miniature version of her sweater. Its painted face had her expression from 5 minutes ago, terrified, eyes wide, mouth trembling. Except the painted mouth was open, carved into a perfect O of silent screaming. Laura's pulse stuttered dangerously, her knees threatening to collapse. "Stop," she whispered, shaking her head, tears beginning to blur her vision. "Stop, stop, please, please," but the room shifted. Not tilted. Not moved. Shifted. Edges softened. Depth collapsed. The corners of her apartment seemed to bend inward, as though the wooden frame beneath the drywall had begun contracting, shrinking, molding itself around her. She heard the unmistakable sound of wood warping, long, low groans echoing through the apartment, the same sound she'd heard from inside the dollhouse at night. She ran for the kitchen window, grabbed the handle, and pulled. It didn't move. She grabbed the curtain rod and swung it against the glass, once, twice, 3 times, but the glass didn't even crack. It felt thick now, too thick, like plexiglass reinforced with something denser than plastic. She turned. Peg Laura stood just a few feet behind her, blocking the doorway. Its little wooden hands twitched. On the coffee table, the original dollhouse rattled slightly, its walls expanding outward as though breathing. Its lights pulsed warmly, greedily, like a beacon. Laura backed into the counter, gripping the edge so tightly her knuckles turned lifeless white. "You're not me," she whispered, voice cracking into a sob. "You can't be me." The peg Laura cocked its head. Then, slowly, jerkily, it raised its hand and pointed toward the dollhouse. Laura shook her head wildly. "No," she whimpered. "No, I'm not going in there." But something tugged. Hard. Not physical. Not a hand. A pull in her vision, like gravity shifting direction. The dollhouse's tiny front door swung open with a soft wooden sigh. A draft of warm, sweet air drifted out, too warm compared to a freezing apartment. Too alive. And then she heard it. A whisper. Small. Dry. Breathless. Come home. Laura screamed and bolted for her bedroom closet, the only door not currently blocked, but the peg Laura was faster than something that small and wooden should ever be. It darted forward in short, unnatural bursts, intercepting her with a stiff-armed shove that sent her stumbling backward. She crashed into her dresser, knocking a lamp to the floor. The bulb shattered into a spray of white. The room dimmed to a soft, flickering twilight. The peg Laura advanced again, and as it drew close, Laura felt the horrifying warmth radiating from it. Not heat, not life, but a possessive, coiling warmth, like the air inside a sealed box that had been holding breath for far too long. She tried to push past it, but its small wooden hands clamped around her wrist with a grip so cold she gasped. The dollhouse lights flared again. The room twisted. The floor beneath her feet softened, not carpet, not hardwood, but something that felt like cardboard. Painted cardboard. She blinked rapidly, trying to clear the distortion clouding her vision. But the more she blinked, the smaller the room seemed to become. The walls drew closer. The doorframes shrank. The window stretched into a flatter rectangle. Her furniture blurted around the edges, colors washing out. No, she whispered. No, 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 she fell backward. Onto a floor too smooth. Too perfect, too miniature. She scrambled to her feet and saw, horrifically, that her apartment was changing scale around her. Becoming smaller. Becoming dollhouse-sized. And on the coffee table, now impossibly high above her like a towering cliff, she saw the original dollhouse shutter, then expand outward like a blooming wooden flower. It grew. And grew. Its tiny windows widened. Its tiny roof lifted. Its little rooms unfolded outward into full size. Seamlessly. Smoothly. As though the dollhouse had always been capable of it, just waiting for permission. Laura screamed for help, for neighbors, for anyone, but her voice sounded faint, muffled, swallowed by thick walls. She ran for her apartment door, but now it was only 6 inches tall, shrinking faster with each panicked step she took. Behind her, the peg Laura moved with horrible grace, its long shadow stretching across the floor like a hand closing over her life. The dollhouse, full size now, stood where her living room had been, its warm light spilling across the contracting walls. From its open front door, she heard it, giggling, whispering, coaxing. Come home. Laura stumbled backward into her miniature bedroom, but the doorway was shrinking too fast, closing like the mouth of a tightening trap. Her foot slipped. Her vision spun. And then, hands. Small hands. Wooden hands. They grabbed her ankles, her wrists, her waist. Dozens of them. Pulling. Guiding. Lifting. She screamed and kicked, but her limbs were leaden, slow, her strength slipping out of her like water through a sieve. She clawed at the carpet, now flat, painted wood, trying to catch hold of anything. The peg Laura leaned over her. Its blank face hovered inches from hers. And slowly, horribly, the blank wooden surface rippled. Shifted. Painted itself. Her own terrified expression blossomed across it, perfect and trembling. No, Laura whispered, barely audible through her sobbing breath. Please, please, don't. The peg Laura pressed a wooden finger gently to her lips. Hush, it whispered, voice tiny, eager, you're home. And with one final pull, the hands dragged her through the shrinking doorway, into the dollhouse. Into the tiny bedroom. Into the painted world of fake walls and miniature furniture and impossible scale, where the air smelled of varnish and dust and longing. The last thing she saw before the walls snapped shut around her was the real apartment, returning to its full size, empty, silent, and still. Then darkness. And then, light. A tiny window. Frosted at the edges. She crawled forward, weak, trembling, and when she reached the window, she looked out. She was small. The world was huge. Her apartment was a replica beyond the glass. And in the room outside, standing before the life-sized dollhouse, stood a new wooden figure. A perfect version of her body. Full size. Painted with her face. Wearing her clothes. Breathing with her breath. Living in her home. It turned, slowly, and looked at her with painted eyes that glimmered with something disturbingly alive. Laura pounded on the tiny window with both fists. "Let me out," she screamed. But her voice came out muted. Small. Distant. Like sound traveling through layers of cardboard. The wooden Laura smiled. Tilted its head. Leaned close to the dollhouse window. And in the smallest, driest voice imaginable, it whispered, "Now we can be alone. Forever." In the hours after Laura Bishop was pulled into the dollhouse, hours that felt both endless and fragmented, as though time itself had adopted the jagged rhythm of a music box winding down, she came to understand a new scale of existence, one that operated on a quiet, suffocating logic where every inch of space was dictated by intention rather than physics. And every breath she took was shaped not by her lungs but by the architecture of a world built to keep her, display her, and cherish her like a prized trinket. The first thing she noticed inside her new prison was the sound, a soft, omnipresent rustling, like tiny fingertips brushing against the walls, the floorboards, the furniture, the ceiling, creating a constant static of small wooden touches that filled the air the way dust filled sunlight. It wasn't loud, in fact, it was nearly soothing, if comfort could ever be something so wrong. The second thing she noticed was the smell, cedar and varnish and the faint sweetness of something old as attic trunks, old as childhood forgotten toys, old as memories folded into corners and left to dry. The third thing she noticed was the figure outside. The wooden Laura. Her replacement. Her puppet. Her mirror. It moved through her real apartment with unsettling grace, adjusting the thermostat, tidying her desk, stretching in the morning light as though muscles rippled beneath the painted wood. It brewed coffee. It hummed. It stood before the full-sized dollhouse, her prison, every so often and tapped lightly on the roof as if checking whether she was still inside, still alive, still afraid. And Laura was all of those things. She had tried screaming until her throat went raw, but inside the dollhouse, her voice dissolved into a muffled, cotton-thick whisper that the wooden Laura simply smiled at. She had tried breaking the windows, but the miniature panes felt like reinforced resin, smooth and unyielding under her fists. She had tried biting, scratching, kicking, but her body felt weaker here, as though effort shrank with every movement, as if the dollhouse itself punished exertion by draining her strength into the walls. Worst of all, she soon discovered she wasn't alone. At first it was only glimpses, another tiny shadow flickering at the edge of a doorway, a shape disappearing just as she turned her head, but soon she began to see the other residents. The occupants the dollhouse had claimed before her. A small girl in a frilled dress, her face rubbed to a blank oval, sat in the corner of the miniature living room, turning a wooden teacup in her hands with slow, patient movements. A thin man with a carved suit and polished shoes leaned stiffly against the kitchen island, his head permanently tilted as though listening for instructions. A woman with a painted apron stood frozen by the stove, one arm raised toward a pot that no longer existed, her other arm snapped off, splintering neatly along the joint. They did not move. They did not blink. They did not breathe. But they watched. Their wooden eyes followed her, their blank faces dangling ever so slightly as she walked by, their limbs twitching just enough to assure her they were not inert. They were waiting. For her. For direction. For companionship. For someone living who could still feel fear on their behalf. Laura backed away from them, holding her trembling arms tight against her ribs, pressing herself into the farthest corner of the miniature bedroom as panic clawed up her throat. "Leave me alone," she whispered, but the words came out thin and papery, as though spoken through layers of cotton. The tiny figures did not move closer. But the dollhouse shifted. She felt it, an almost imperceptible tilt beneath her feet, like a boat rocked by a distant wave. A soft creak rolled through the walls, followed by the faint sound of something being set down outside. Then footsteps. Human-sized. Walking toward her. She scrambled to the tiny window and peered out. Wooden Laura approached the dollhouse, each step controlled, measured, elegant. It knelt before the facade, its painted face expressionless and serene. "Let me out," Laura mouthed silently, pressing her palms against the cold glass. The wooden Laura tilted its head, studying her with a disturbingly thoughtful stillness, as though contemplating how to best arrange a delicate figurine. Then it raised one hand and gently tapped the roof of the dollhouse. Once. Twice. 3 times. Immediately, the walls around Laura trembled with a low hum. The tiny furniture straightened. The broken peg figures adjusted themselves. The lights brightened. The room warmed. The dollhouse had been activated, obedient to its mistress. Laura backed away from the window, pulse pounding. "No," she whispered. "Don't." But she already knew what was coming. She felt it before she saw it. The dollhouse door creaked open, and from the living room emerged a peg Laura, the tiny version of her that had first moved on its own. It approached her in short, jerky motions, its painted face now perfect, identical to hers. Its little wooden hands opened, reaching. Laura backed away until her back struck the dresser. There was nowhere to run. "Stay," the peg whispered, its voice thin and whistling, like sound passing through hollow pipes. "You belong here." Laura shook her head fiercely, tears streaking her face. "I don't. This isn't my home." The peg Laura stepped closer. "But you made it your home. You cared for me. You placed me here. You built us a world." Laura felt nausea twist her stomach. "I didn't build this," she spat. "I didn't choose this." The peg Laura's painted eyes blinked, slowly, chillingly. "But I chose you." Something shifted in the air. A click. A snap. The dollhouse bedroom door swung shut behind her. Then another. The closet door sealed. The tiny window darkened. Laura spun in desperation, searching for any crack, any seam, any weakness, but the room had become a sealed box, smooth and perfect, every surface vibrating faintly with a hum that felt like contentment, like the house itself was purring. The peg Laura reached for her hand and squeezed with surprising strength, its varnished fingers pressing into her skin with possessive warmth. "It's all right," it whispered, voice soothing, coaxing. "You won't be lonely anymore." Laura tried to pull away, but her arms felt heavy, sluggish, unresponsive. She tried to shout, but her voice came out tinny, hollow, like something small trapped inside a shell. She looked down. Her skin had paled, no, not paled. Smoothed. Grain-like patterns shimmered beneath the surface of her arms. Her fingers stiffened. Her elbows tightened. Her joints clicked softly. "No," she gasped. "No, no, please." The peg Laura leaned close, its wooden forehead touching hers. "Hush," it breathed. "It only hurts at first." Laura screamed, or tried to. But her mouth barely opened. The hinge of her jaw no longer worked. The scream rattled inside her like loose air inside a box. Her knees locked. Her shoulders stiffened. Her breath slowed and thinned until it felt less like breathing and more like remembering what breathing used to feel like. Her vision blurred around the edges. Her eyelids froze halfway down. She toppled like a falling figurine, slow, helpless, inevitable, collapsing onto the miniature bed with a hollow wooden thud. She could no longer lift her hands. Or blink. Or move at all. She could only see through the narrow field her frozen neck allowed. The peg Laura climbed onto the bed beside her, gently propping her into a sitting position. Laura felt each adjustment as a distant sensation, muffled and detached, like a memory being manipulated rather than a body. "You're perfect," the peg Laura whispered with a little sigh. "Better than before." Laura fought to move a finger, a toe, anything, but her limbs were carved now, her joints fixed. She could not curl her hands. She could not scream. She could not even cry. She was a doll. A doll in a dollhouse. A prisoner with a painted face. And then the walls around her shifted again, widening. Brightening. Opening into view. The dollhouse back panel had been lifted. Wooden Laura, the life-sized imposter, stood outside, peering in with a gentle, content smile painted across her face. "Welcome home," the wooden Laura whispered. It reached into the dollhouse and placed a tiny wooden cup beside her, a miniature version of her favorite mug. Then it reached farther, toward the tiny wooden apron woman. It lifted her carefully, like a curator handling fragile art, and placed the apron woman on the kitchen floor. A new arrangement. A new family. A new tableau. Laura could only watch, frozen, as wooden Laura continued tidying the dollhouse residents, moving them to better positions, adjusting their clothes, whispering soft, loving instructions. When it reached Laura, it paused and brushed a varnished fingertip along her cheek. "So pretty," it whispered. "So quiet." Behind it, in the full-sized apartment, the wind howled. The lights flickered. The storm raged on. But inside the dollhouse, everything stilled into a perfect, suffocating silence. Wooden Laura closed the dollhouse back panel with a soft click. Laura was plunged into dimness, the only light seeping through tiny cracks in the miniature windows. Hours passed. Or minutes. Or days. Time no longer mattered. Eventually, the front door to the real apartment opened. Footsteps entered. A voice called, "Hello. Laura. Are you okay?" The storm cleared. "I thought I'd check on you," it was the building manager. Laura wanted to scream, but her painted mouth stayed frozen in a gentle, permanent half-expression. The footsteps drew closer. "Laura. Why is it so cold in silence?" And then a soft, horrified gasp. Through her narrow window view, Laura saw the manager approach the full-sized dollhouse, puzzled. "What is this?" Laura tried to move. To blink. To twitch. Anything. Nothing happened. The manager placed a hand on the dollhouse roof. Wooden Laura stepped into view behind him. Smiling. "She's not home right now," the wooden Laura said sweetly. Laura watched helplessly as the manager froze. Eyes widening. And then, the dollhouse lights flickered on. All of them. Every room illuminated. Every figure ready. Another scream never came. The apartment fell silent once more, and inside the miniature bedroom, Laura sat perfectly still, eyes fixed forever forward, listening as tiny footsteps began to move through the walls again, shifting, tapping, rearranging, preparing the house for its next resident. And in the faintest whisper, barely audible over the hum of the dollhouse heart, she heard it speak to her, "Don't worry. We always make room for family. You made it. To the other side. 5 tales, 5 shadows. 5 long, dark corridors we walked together. Some stories end when the last word fades. Others linger. Maybe you still hear that bus engine humming, far beneath the floorboards. Maybe there's a drawer in your home you don't remember opening. A cup that wasn't there yesterday. Or a page missing from a book you thought you'd never touched. Or maybe, as you lie there now in the dark, you can sense the faint warmth of someone else in the room. Someone patient. Someone quiet. Someone who heard the stories with you and decided to stay. But it's late, and you should sleep. Let the static in your mind settle. Let the night soften its claws. Let the stories curl up somewhere just out of sight. If they follow you into your dreams, well, dreams are only another kind of hallway. And you already know how to walk in the dark. Until next time, traveler. Keep a light by the door. Keep your windows closed. And if you hear a knock at an hour when no one should be visiting, don't answer. Not right away. Good night. And good luck. From Little Dream.